While cleaning her father's study, a millionaire's daughter discovered an old photo of his mistress. Investigation revealed an impossible truth. The mistress was her own biological mother, who had been forced to give her up for adoption. Her father had unknowingly fallen in love with the woman he'd separated from their child. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams slanting through the tall, arched windows of Richard Harding's study. Clara, his only daughter, ran a gloved hand along the polished mahogany desk, the cool smoothness a stark contrast to the nervous tremor in her fingers. The air hung heavy with the scent of aged leather and pipe tobacco, a familiar fragrance that suddenly felt suffocating. She'd been tasked with clearing out the study, a chore that felt more like an archaeological dig into a life she barely understood. She'd found it tucked away in a forgotten drawer, nestled amongst yellowed legal documents and faded photographs. A sepia-toned image of a woman with eyes that mirrored her own, startlingly, undeniably her own. The woman's smile was radiant, mischievous, a stark contrast to the formal portraits of Clara's mother that adorned the hallway. A gasp escaped Clara's lips. Impossible. Her father, the stoic, emotionally reserved Richard Harding, the titan of industry, had a mistress? The thought felt alien, a betrayal of the carefully constructed image she held of her family. Disbelief warred with a burgeoning, unsettling curiosity. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't just some forgotten fling. The resemblance was uncanny. This woman, could she be? A wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm her. Clara clutched the photo tighter, her knuckles white. The elegant script on the back, barely legible, offered a single clue. Isabella. The name felt like a whisper on the wind, a secret barely contained. This wasn't just a photograph. It was a key, unlocking a door to a past she never knew existed. A past that threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew about herself and her father. The comforting, if distant, world she inhabited suddenly felt precarious, the ground beneath her feet shifting. The investigation had begun. Clara traced the faded script on the back of the photograph again, the cool paper a stark contrast to the burning heat rising in her chest. Isabella. The name echoed in the silent study, a fragile whisper against the backdrop of her father's imposing presence, a presence that now felt both familiar and utterly alien. She ran a hand through her hair, the silken strands catching on the chill of the late afternoon air. Doubt warred with a growing, terrifying certainty. She rose, the antique chair groaning a protest under her weight. The study, usually a sanctuary of calm order, now felt claustrophobic, each shadowed corner whispering secrets. She wandered to the tall windows, the sprawling gardens below a blur through her tear-blurred vision. The meticulously manicured lawns seemed to mock her internal chaos. Everything felt fragile, precarious, like a house of cards about to collapse. Days blurred into a frantic search. Clara unearthed fragments of Isabella's life, a faded love letter tucked within a worn diary, a fleeting mention in a local newspaper clipping from decades past, detailing a socialite's sudden disappearance. Each clue felt like a breadcrumb, leading her deeper into a labyrinth of half-truths and unspoken pain. The library became her refuge, the hushed silence a welcome contrast to the tempest raging within. One evening, hunched over a dusty genealogy book, a chilling detail emerged. A birth date, a name. Clara's breath hitched. The date matched her own almost to the day. The name, subtly disguised under an alias, was undeniable. It was her mother's. A strangled sob escaped her lips. The carefully constructed world of her privileged life crumbled around her. The cold certainty settled, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. Isabella wasn't just a mistress. She was her mother, her own mother, stolen from her, a life she'd never known. The weight of this revelation was crushing, the sheer impossibility of it twisting her insides. The elegant study, once a symbol of her father's success, now felt like a gilded cage, a testament to a life built on a foundation of lies. The scent of pipe tobacco suddenly felt like a betrayal, a constant reminder of a past she desperately needed to understand. a past that had irrevocably changed her. The weight of the revelation pressed down on Clara, a physical burden as much as an emotional one. The scent of old paper and leather, usually comforting in her father's study, now felt suffocating. She sank onto the plush velvet armchair, the soft fabric offering little solace. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, a stark contrast to the turmoil within her. Tears welled, blurring the already faded photograph of Isabella. A sob escaped, ragged and uncontrolled. "Impossible," she whispered, the word catching in her throat. The carefully constructed facade of her life, a life of privilege and unspoken emptiness, was cracking at the seams. She thought of her father, Richard, his booming laughter now a cruel mockery of the hidden pain she just uncovered. The man who had provided her with everything materially had denied her the most fundamental truth, her mother. She picked up the worn diary she discovered earlier, its pages brittle with age. A pressed flower, its color long faded, fell out. A single, trembling tear landed on the delicate petals. Inside, she found Isabella's elegant script, a testament to a passionate, forbidden love, a love that had given birth to Clara, a love that had been cruelly silenced. The diary entries chronicled a whirlwind romance, punctuated by stolen moments and whispered promises. Then, a sudden shift, the tone darkening, the words filled with desperation and fear. Isabella's fear. Clara's heart ached for a mother she'd never known, a mother who had faced a choice no woman should ever have to make. The next few days were a blur of frantic research, long hours in libraries, poring over old newspapers and birth records. She felt like a detective in a grim, personal mystery, chasing shadows and half-truths. Each piece of information unearthed felt like a fresh wound, tearing away at the carefully woven tapestry of her life. Sleep offered little respite, her dreams haunted by fragmented images, a woman's tearful face, a child's hushed cry, a shadowy figure looming in the background. The truth, once discovered, proved to be more devastating than she could have ever imagined. The gilded cage of her privileged life now felt like a prison, her freedom stolen. The impossibility of it all settled over her like a heavy cloak. The chipped porcelain of her teacup felt cold against Clara's trembling fingers. Sunlight streamed through the arched windows of her opulent bedroom, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the golden rays, a stark contrast to the darkness swirling inside her. She reread Isabella's diary entry, the elegant script a haunting echo of a life she'd never known. Asterisk, Richard, my heart aches for you, for us. But this sacrifice is for our child's future. Asterisk, a sob escaped, catching in her throat. The carefully curated perfection of her room, the silk sheets, the antique furniture, felt suffocating. She longed for the rough comfort of worn jeans and a simple sweater, anything to escape the gilded cage of her privileged life. She picked up her phone, the cool glass a momentary comfort against her hot cheeks. Should she call her father? The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. Richard, the man who'd provided her with everything materially, yet had withheld the most crucial piece of her identity. Her gaze fell upon a framed photograph on her vanity. A picture of her as a child, beaming at the camera, her father's hand protectively on her shoulder. His smile was genuine, a stark contrast to the coldness she now associated with him. Suddenly, the image felt alien, a memory superimposed onto a false narrative. Was that genuine love or a carefully constructed performance? The doubt gnawed at her, sharp and persistent. A text message pinged. It was her best friend, Amelia. Everything okay? You've been MIA all day. Dinner tonight. Clara hesitated. How could she explain this? How could she explain the chasm that had opened up in her life, revealing a truth so shocking, so profoundly unsettling? She typed a response, her fingers clumsy, the words failing to capture the magnitude of her turmoil. Dinner, maybe. I'm dealing with something. It's a lot. She hit send, the message a pale reflection of the emotional earthquake raging within. The weight of her discovery, the impossible truth of her parentage, threatened to crush her. Sleep, she knew, would bring no solace. Only the relentless pursuit of answers, the desperate need to find Isabella, could offer any chance of peace. The scent of old paper and dust clung to Clara's clothes as she left her father's study, the heavy oak door closing with a muffled thud behind her. The photograph, a faded sepia image of a laughing woman with eyes startlingly like her own, burned into her memory. Isabella. The name whispered from the yellowed pages of a forgotten diary felt both alien and intimately familiar. She wandered through the sprawling mansion, the polished floors echoing her unsteady steps. The opulence, once a source of comfort, now felt suffocating, a gilded cage built on a foundation of lies. She found herself in the sunroom, its expansive windows offering a panoramic view of the manicured gardens. The meticulously arranged flowers, usually a source of quiet appreciation, seemed mockingly perfect against the chaos in her heart. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A text from Amelia. Still MIA? I'm worried. Clara sighed, the weight of her secret pressing down on her. How could she explain this impossible truth? How could she articulate the seismic shift in her understanding of her life, her family, her very identity? She sat heavily on a wicker chair, the cool rattan a slight comfort against her burning skin. The sunlight, once warm and inviting, now felt harsh, exposing the cracks in her carefully constructed world. Panic clawed at her. She needed answers. She needed to know more about Isabella. She needed to know if the woman in the photograph was truly her mother, and if so, why her father had kept this secret for so long. The thought of confronting Richard filled her with a mixture of dread and determination. The man she had always considered her rock, her protector, was now a stranger, shrouded in a veil of deception. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. She picked up her phone again, her thumb hovering over her father's contact. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, mirroring the turmoil within her. She needed a plan, a strategy, but all she felt was the overwhelming urge to unravel this mystery, to face the truth, however painful it might be. The future seemed uncertain, a vast and terrifying unknown, but the present held a single, burning imperative: find Isabella. Clara's fingers trembled as she typed Isabella's name into the search engine. The stark white screen seemed to mock her, a blank canvas reflecting the emptiness she felt inside. The scent of lilies, usually a calming presence in her father's study, now felt cloying, a suffocating sweetness clinging to the air like a shroud. She scrolled through page after page of results, each click a tiny stab of anxiety. The internet offered little, only fleeting mentions of an Isabella Moreau, a name echoing in the dusty recesses of her memory. A sudden sharp intake of breath escaped her lips. A photograph, a grainy image nestled within a local historical society's online archive, stopped her scroll. A younger Isabella, her face etched with a wistful sadness, stood beside a bustling marketplace. It was her. The eyes, the delicate curve of her chin, the way she tilted her head, all undeniably familiar. Clara felt a lump forming in her throat, a suffocating pressure against her ribs. Tears welled, blurring the image on the screen. She leaned back, the plush velvet of the antique chair offering little comfort. The weight of the discovery pressed down on her. This wasn't just a historical curiosity. This was her mother. A mother she never knew, a mother stolen from her. Amelia's concerned texts pinged unanswered, a silent testament to her spiraling emotional state. She needed to talk to someone, to share this impossible truth, but the fear of disbelief, of ridicule, held her captive. The phone rang, jarring her from her reverie. It was her father. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence of the room. Should she answer? Could she bear to hear his voice, knowing the depth of his deception? The phone continued to ring, each shrill tone a reminder of the chasm that had opened up between them. Clara stared at the image of Isabella, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, mirroring the silent stream of grief flowing through her. The truth, however painful, had to be faced. She needed to know. She had to know. She picked up the phone, her voice trembling as she answered, "Hello, Father?" Richard's voice, a familiar yet distant rumble, crackled through the phone. "Clara, darling, is everything all right? Amelia mentioned you weren't feeling well." His concern, genuine or feigned, felt like a brittle mask, barely concealing the tremor beneath. Clara swallowed, the lump in her throat refusing to budge. The scent of lilies, heavy and cloying, filled the room, a suffocating reminder of the opulent prison of her life. "Father," she began, her voice a fragile whisper against the weight of her discovery. I need to talk to you about something important." The words felt inadequate, clumsy against the enormity of the truth. She glanced at the photograph again, Isabella's sorrowful eyes mirroring her own turmoil. A strained silence hung between them. Clara could almost hear Richard's hesitation, the carefully constructed facade of his life beginning to crumble. "What is it, Clara? You sound upset." His voice held a hint of apprehension, a subtle shift from his usual authoritative tone. "I found something," Clara said, her voice catching. "In your study, a photograph of a woman." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. The antique chair felt suddenly too hard, the velvet pressing into her thighs. "A photograph?" he repeated, his voice tight. "What kind of photograph?" The question, though seemingly innocent, held a sharp edge, a defensive tremor beneath the calm exterior. Clara knew then, instinctively, that he was aware of what she had found. "Of Isabella Moreau," she whispered, the name a foreign yet familiar melody. The silence that followed was deafening, a tangible presence in the room, thick with unspoken accusations and anxieties. The sound of her own breathing filled her ears, a frantic rhythm against the backdrop of Richard's controlled silence. The weight of her discovery pressed down on her, a crushing burden threatening to suffocate her. The lily scent intensified, a sickly sweet perfume of betrayal and hidden truths. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the storm that was about to break. Clara held the photograph, its faded image blurring through her tears. The scent of lilies, a constant reminder of her father's opulent world, now felt suffocating. The antique phone pressed against her ear, Richard's voice a distant tremor in the oppressive silence. "Isabella Moreau," he repeated, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. He hadn't denied it. The admission hung between them, unspoken yet undeniable. The plush velvet of her armchair offered no comfort. Every thread felt like a tiny prick, mirroring the sharp sting of betrayal that pierced her heart. Outside, the city hummed, a discordant symphony to the turmoil within. But here, in this gilded cage, only the heavy scent of lilies and the weight of her discovery remained. I found letters too," Clara managed, her voice barely audible. The words escaped as if pulled from her by an unseen force. Each syllable felt like a confession, a stripping away of her carefully constructed reality. She thought of the faded script, the passionate whispers of a love her father had so meticulously hidden. A long silence stretched, broken only by Clara's ragged breaths. The ornate clock on the mantelpiece ticked with agonizing slowness, each second a hammer blow to her already fractured heart. Richard finally spoke, his voice strained, devoid of the usual authoritative timbre. "Letters? What do they say?" Clara described the fragments, the stolen moments, the fervent longing expressed in Isabella's delicate script. She painted a picture of a forbidden love, vibrant and passionate, a stark contrast to the sterile formality of her own life. With each word, the fragile mask of Richard's composure cracked further, revealing the tremor of guilt and regret beneath. The silence that followed was heavier, laced with the unspoken acknowledgement of a shared past shrouded in secrecy. The weight of their silence threatened to crush her. She needed to know more, needed to understand. "Where is she, Father?" she whispered, the question laced with a desperate hope, a fragile thread in the unraveling tapestry of her life. The lilies suffocated her. She needed air, truth, understanding. The photograph, a damning testament to a life lived in shadows, remained clutched in her hand, a cold weight against the burning heat of her tears. The antique desk, usually a symbol of her father's imposing power, now felt like a tomb. Clara traced the faded ink of Isabella Moreau's signature on a crumpled letter, the paper brittle under her fingertips. The scent of old parchment and dust mingled with the lingering perfume of lilies, a constant, cloying presence in her father's study. The words, written in a spidery, elegant hand, spoke of stolen moments, clandestine meetings, and a love both passionate and desperate. "My dearest Richard," the letter began, the words echoing in Clara's mind, a haunting melody of a life she never knew. She felt a sharp pang of longing, a desperate need to connect with this woman, this ghost from her father's past who was, impossibly, a part of her own. She reread a passage, her breath catching in her throat. "The garden by the lake, under the weeping willow, remember?" The image conjured was vivid, romantic, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile elegance of her own upbringing. A sob escaped her lips, a raw sound in the suffocating silence. She felt adrift, unmoored from the life she thought she knew, tossed on a turbulent sea of grief, betrayal, and a nascent hope. A soft knock startled her. Her father stood in the doorway, his usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. The stern lines of his face were softened by an almost imperceptible tremor. He entered slowly, his gait hesitant, as if approaching wounded prey. "Clara," he began, his voice a low rumble. I need to understand. What have you found?" His vulnerability was startling, shattering the image of the powerful, untouchable man she'd always known. The strength in his usual tone was replaced by a fragile uncertainty. Clara rose, clutching the letter to her chest as if it held a vital part of her soul. "Letters, father?" she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Letters from Isabella Moreau. She speaks of a love, a life." She trailed off, unable to articulate the profound upheaval within her. The weight of her discovery pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. The lilies, once a symbol of her privileged world, now represented a suffocating lie, a fragrant shroud concealing a painful truth. She looked at her father, at the man who had unwittingly been both her father and the unwitting architect of her fractured identity, and saw, for the first time, not just a powerful figure, but a deeply wounded man. The revelation hung between them, a fragile, unspoken understanding, poised on the brink of a devastating confrontation. The heavy oak door creaked shut behind Richard, the silence amplifying the tremor in his hands. He stood rigidly, the scent of his expensive cologne battling the lingering sweetness of lilies. Clara, clutching the brittle letter, felt a wave of dizziness. The elegant script blurred, the words losing their sharp edges. "The garden by the lake, under the weeping willow." The image was a cruel mockery of her own carefully manicured life. It's more than just letters, father," she managed, her voice a fragile whisper. She felt the familiar sting of unshed tears prick her eyes. The polished mahogany desk, usually a symbol of her father's control, now felt oppressive, a cage built around a devastating secret. Richard's gaze dropped to the floor, his perfectly shined shoes suddenly looking out of place in the dimly lit study. The silence stretched, taut and heavy with unspoken accusations. He ran a hand through his silver hair, the gesture betraying a weariness that years of wealth and power hadn't masked. I don't understand," he finally said, his voice rough, devoid of its usual commanding tone. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for understanding, a plea she wasn't sure she could grant. "Who is this, Isabella?" Clara took a shaky breath, the scent of old paper and dust filling her lungs, a suffocating reminder of the secrets buried within the antique desk. She was your mistress, father?" she whispered, the word hanging heavy in the air, a bitter pill to swallow. The word mistress felt inadequate, a cold, clinical term for the passionate love story unfolding before her. But she was also my mother. The confession hung between them, a fragile, explosive thing. Richard's shoulders slumped, the carefully constructed facade of his composure crumbling. He looked older, suddenly frail, the weight of years pressing down on him. The powerful man, the man who controlled vast empires, was reduced to a trembling figure, lost in the labyrinth of his past mistakes. The lilies, once a symbol of her opulent life, now seemed to mock her with their suffocating sweetness. The scent of betrayal clung to the air, thick and cloying. The truth, raw and brutal, hung between them, a chasm waiting to swallow them both. Clara's trembling hand traced the faded ink of a photograph, Isabella's youthful smile a haunting echo of her own. The scent of lilies, Richard's favorite, clashed with the musty aroma of the antique desk, a tangible symbol of the chasm opening between father and daughter. "It's impossible," Richard whispered, his voice raspy, the carefully constructed composure crumbling. He ran a hand through his thinning silver hair, his usual impeccably groomed appearance now disheveled, mirroring the turmoil within. The afternoon sun, filtering through the tall windows of the study, cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of an antique grandfather clock, each tick a hammer blow against Richard's fragile composure. Clara watched him, a mixture of pity and anger churning within her. The man who had dictated her life, who had controlled every aspect of her existence, was now a broken figure, overwhelmed by a truth he'd buried for decades. "Impossible?" she echoed, her voice barely a breath. "But the letter, the garden by the lake, it all points to her." She held up the brittle paper, the faded script a testament to years of concealed secrets. "There were complications," Richard mumbled, his gaze fixed on the Persian rug, avoiding her eyes. The words felt inadequate, a feeble attempt to explain a lifetime of deceit. Things were different then. He avoided her gaze, the weight of his unspoken words heavy in the air. He shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, the luxurious comfort a cruel irony against the turmoil in his soul. Clara felt a wave of nausea. The polished surfaces of the study, once symbols of her privileged life, now felt cold, alien. The carefully constructed world around her was shattering, revealing a painful, ugly truth. "Different how?" she asked, her voice laced with a bitterness she hadn't known she possessed. The lilies, once a symbol of opulent luxury, now felt like a suffocating presence. The sweet scent a mocking reminder of her father's betrayal. The weight of unspoken years, of hidden emotions and deliberate omissions, pressed down on them both. The truth was a bitter draught they were both forced to swallow. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unanswered questions, a silence that spoke volumes. Clara traced the faded inscription on the back of the photograph, a barely legible cursive script hinting at a Lake Geneva, 1958. The scent of old paper and dust filled her nostrils, a stark contrast to the usual floral perfume that permeated her father's study. The room, usually a sanctuary of polished mahogany and hushed elegance, felt suffocating. Richard sat slumped in his leather chair, his normally impeccable attire rumpled, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond the usual lines of age. The grandfather clock ticked, each chime a sharp stab of reality. "Isabella?" Clara whispered, the name tasting strange on her tongue, a foreign echo in her meticulously ordered world. The image of the woman in the photograph, young and radiant, haunted her. Could this be her mother? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, a cold wave of disbelief battling with a nascent, terrifying hope. Richard cleared his throat, the sound raspy and strained. "There are things I never told you, Clara." His voice was a low murmur, barely audible above the ticking clock. He looked up, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own burgeoning turmoil. The afternoon sun cast long, dramatic shadows, turning the familiar study into a stage for a painful drama unfolding. "Things you deliberately kept hidden," Clara countered, her voice trembling slightly, but firm. The anger simmered beneath a rising tide of confusion and hurt. She clutched the photograph, the worn edges digging into her palm, a physical manifestation of her gripping emotions. He sighed, a heavy, weary sound, and ran a hand through his thinning silver hair. The past, it's not easily explained. It was a different time, a different world. He paused, searching for words that could bridge the chasm opening between them, words that couldn't possibly mend the shattered pieces of her life. A different world where you abandoned my mother? Clara challenged, her voice sharp, the accusation hanging heavy in the air. The polished surfaces of the room, usually symbols of her secure life, now seemed cold and unforgiving. The lilies, Richard's favorite, their cloying sweetness felt suffocating, a perverse reminder of a life built on secrets and lies. Richard flinched, his gaze dropping to his hands. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken accusations and years of carefully guarded secrets, the weight of which pressed down on both father and daughter, a shared burden of a painful truth finally revealed. The sun dipped lower, casting long, mournful shadows across the room, mirroring the deepening darkness in their hearts. The antique clock ticked on, each tick a solemn reminder of the irrevocable passage of time and the irreversible damage done. The dusty scent of old paper clung to Clara's fingers as she reread the faded inscription. Lake Geneva, 1958. The photograph, a brittle relic of a past she never knew, felt strangely warm against her skin, a stark contrast to the icy dread creeping into her heart. Richard's study, usually a haven of quiet opulence, now felt like a tomb. The grandfather clock's relentless ticking echoed the frantic beat of her own heart. Isabella, she whispered again, the name a fragile bridge to an unknown world. The woman in the photograph, with her laughing eyes and cascade of dark hair, looked hauntingly familiar, a ghostly echo of a lineage Clara had never imagined. Richard sat rigidly in his chair, his usual composure shattered. The lines on his face deepened, etched by years of carefully guarded secrets, now brutally exposed. There's so much you don't know, Clara, he began, his voice a low, rough murmur. The words hung heavy in the air, a prelude to a confession that threatened to dismantle her carefully constructed world. You deliberately kept it hidden? Clara retorted, her voice trembling but resolute. The carefully manicured lilies in a crystal vase seemed to mock her with their suffocating sweetness, a cruel irony against the bitter truth unfurling before her. The polished surfaces of the room, once symbols of security and comfort, now reflected the cold, hard reality of betrayal. It was a different time, Richard pleaded, his voice cracking. He looked up, his eyes mirroring the profound sorrow and guilt that mirrored her own burgeoning pain. The afternoon sun cast elongated shadows across the room, transforming the familiar space into a theater of painful revelation. Clara felt a cold wave of nausea. The elegant tapestry on the wall, the priceless sculptures, even the familiar scent of old leather and pipe tobacco, everything seemed tainted by the revelation. A different time where you abandoned my mother? She challenged, the accusation a raw, stinging arrow. The silence that followed was deafening, a chasm of unspoken words and years of carefully constructed lies. The ticking clock became a relentless reminder of time's relentless march, an irreversible current sweeping away her carefully built life. The weight of the unspoken truth pressed heavily on them both, father and daughter bound by a shared burden of grief and betrayal. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that mirrored the growing darkness in their hearts, a darkness that threatened to engulf them both. The truth, once hidden, was now a stark, unshakable reality. Clara stumbled back, the ornate chair groaning under her weight. The room, once a sanctuary of familiar comfort, now felt claustrophobic, the opulent furnishings pressing in like accusing witnesses. The scent of lilies, usually so calming, now felt cloying, sickly sweet. She stared at the photograph, her reflection shimmering in the polished surface of the antique desk, a stranger staring back from a life she'd never known. Tears welled, blurring the already faded image of Isabella. It wasn't deliberate, Richard whispered, his voice choked with emotion. He reached out, his hand trembling as he hesitated over the air between them. The gesture, intended to comfort, only widened the gulf that had suddenly opened between them. Clara flinched away. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice brittle, laced with a pain that cut deeper than any physical wound. How could you? How could you keep this from me for all these years?" He looked away, his gaze settling on the flickering flames in the hearth, the fire mirroring the turmoil raging within him. I was young, foolish. There were pressures, societal expectations. His voice trailed off, the words sounding hollow, inadequate. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the ticking clock, each tick a hammer blow against Clara's fragile composure. The weight of her father's confession pressed down, crushing her under a tide of betrayal and loss. The meticulously crafted life she'd known, a life built on a foundation of lies, crumbled around her. "Pressures," Clara echoed, her voice laced with disbelief. "My mother was forced to give me away because of pressures." The sheer audacity of it, the callous indifference, ignited a fury within her that battled with the overwhelming sorrow. He looked at her then, really looked at her, seeing not just his daughter, but the woman she'd become, the woman he'd unknowingly condemned to a life of enforced ignorance. His eyes filled with tears, not merely tears of remorse, but of profound regret and a devastating recognition of his own failings. "Isabella, she loved you, Clara," he managed, his voice barely a rasp. "More than anything." The words were a lifeline, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their fractured relationship. A faint glimmer of hope flickered amidst the overwhelming despair. The weight of the truth remained crushing, but within its suffocating grip, the seed of understanding had been planted. Clara stared at the photograph, a hollow ache spreading through her chest. The faded image of Isabella, her unknown mother, held a haunting beauty, a wistful smile playing on lips that mirrored her own. The scent of old paper and dust clung to the air, a tangible reminder of the secrets buried within the walls of her father's study. Outside, the relentless rain drummed against the window panes, mirroring the storm raging inside her. Richard sat opposite her, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond his years. The fire in the hearth crackled merrily, but it offered no warmth against the chill that had settled between them. He reached for a crystal decanter, his hand trembling slightly. "There's so much to explain," he began, his voice raspy, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Start with why I never knew," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper, yet sharp with a newfound steel. The carefully constructed facade of her privileged life lay in ruins, shattered by the impossible truth. Each breath felt like a shard of glass piercing her lungs. He poured 2 glasses of brandy, the amber liquid shimmering under the dim light. He offered one to Clara, who refused with a shake of her head. "It wasn't a deliberate act of cruelty," he insisted, his gaze pleading. "Isabella and I, we were young. Our families, they wouldn't have allowed it. The scandal." He swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. "Scandal," Clara echoed, the word a bitter taste on her tongue. "My mother's life, her happiness, sacrificed on the altar of your reputation? You condemned her to a life of silence, of secrecy, and me to a life of lies." Anger, hot and fierce, flared within her, threatening to consume her. She clenched her fists, her knuckles white against the dark wood of the armrest. He flinched at her outburst, the intensity of her emotion striking him with the force of a physical blow. The carefully constructed wall of self-justification began to crumble. "I loved her," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "More than I can ever express, but I was so blinded, so consumed by my own ambitions, by the expectations of others." His voice trailed off, lost in the weight of his regrets. The firelight danced in his eyes, reflecting a deep well of remorse and sorrow. Clara watched him, her anger slowly giving way to a chilling emptiness. The comfortable room seemed to shrink, suffocating her in the suffocating weight of the revelation. The impossible truth hung in the air, a heavy silence punctuated by the ticking clock, a relentless reminder of time lost. a life lived on a foundation of lies. The brandy sat untouched, a testament to the bitter truth that had shattered her world. The weight of it pressed down, a crushing burden of loss and betrayal. Yet, amidst the despair, a fragile ember of curiosity flickered. Who was this woman, Isabella, and what kind of life had she lived? The rain continued its relentless assault, mirroring the turmoil within Clara. She stared at the untouched brandy, its amber glow mocking the emptiness she felt. Richard's confession, a raw outpouring of regret, hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating like the smoke from the dying embers in the hearth. The scent of old leather and polished wood, usually comforting, now felt oppressive, a suffocating reminder of the lies that had underpinned her entire life. "So you loved her?" Clara repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Her voice was flat, devoid of the anger that had momentarily consumed her. It had been replaced by a hollow ache, a profound sense of loss that left her breathless. The carefully constructed world she knew, the privilege and security, felt like a fragile shell, ready to crumble at the slightest touch. Richard nodded, his gaze fixed on the swirling brandy in his glass. He didn't touch it, the liquid mirroring the unshed tears welling in his eyes. "I did," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But fear, ambition, they consumed me. I was a fool." Clara rose, her movements stiff and deliberate. The plush armchair felt alien beneath her, the soft cushions offering no comfort against the icy grip of disillusionment. She walked to the window, the cold glass a welcome contrast to the burning shame she felt. The rain lashed against the panes, a relentless, unforgiving rhythm that echoed the chaotic symphony of emotions within her. She traced the outline of a raindrop clinging to the glass, its fleeting existence mirroring the fragile nature of her own reality. The photograph, a stark testament to a life lived in the shadows, lay forgotten on the table, a visual reminder of the mother she never knew, the life she never had. "And Isabella?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper, lost in the tempestuous storm raging outside and within. The question hung in the air, a fragile bridge across a chasm of betrayal and lost years. The weight of unanswered questions pressed down on her, a crushing burden that threatened to suffocate her. The silence that followed felt unbearable, a tangible manifestation of the years of deception and secrecy. The ticking clock became a deafening hammer, each tick a relentless reminder of time stolen, lives irrevocably altered. The truth, stark and brutal, had shattered her world, leaving her adrift in a sea of uncertainty and loss, grasping for a lifeline in the storm. The impossible truth now felt impossibly real. The next morning dawned gray and sullen, mirroring Clara's mood. The opulent bedroom, usually a haven of silk and comfort, felt like a gilded cage. She lay in bed, the crisp Egyptian cotton sheets doing little to soothe the turmoil within. Richard's confession echoed in her ears, a relentless refrain of regret and lost opportunities. She rose, the heavy brocade curtains muffling the faint sounds of the house waking. The scent of freshly brewed coffee, usually a welcome aroma, did nothing to lift her spirits. She found herself drawn to her father's study, the scene of her discovery. The photograph of Isabella lay where she'd left it, a stark reminder of her fractured reality. A wave of nausea washed over her. She needed answers, a path through this tangled web of deceit. The first step, she decided, was finding Isabella. The old letters, faded and brittle, held a few clues. A mention of a small coastal town, a faded postcard with a blurry image of a quaint cottage. A flicker of hope, fragile but persistent, ignited within her. The task before her was daunting, but the need for connection, for understanding, propelled her forward. Clara sat at her desk, the mahogany cool beneath her fingertips. Her phone, a symbol of modern connection, felt strangely inadequate. She started with online searches, combing through census records, historical archives. Hours blurred into a haze of frustration and determination. The rain outside intensified, a mirror of the emotional storm raging inside her. The sound of the downpour, usually soothing, today felt oppressive, a relentless reminder of the relentless rain that had fallen on Isabella's life. Then a breakthrough, a name, a date, a possible address, a glimmer of hope, fragile yet powerful. The address led to a small coastal town, a place where time seemed to have stood still. The thought of confronting her father filled her with dread. The chasm between them, once imperceptible, now yawned before her, vast and seemingly impassable. She didn't know how to bridge it, or if she even wanted to. But the pull towards Isabella, the yearning for a mother she never knew, was stronger than her fear. She had to try. The impossible truth had shattered her world, but it also presented her with an impossible hope. The journey to Isabella was not just a geographical one, but a journey into the heart of her own identity. The coastal town clung to the cliffside, a cluster of weathered houses huddled against the relentless wind. Clara stepped out of the taxi, the salty tang of the sea air stinging her nostrils. The gray sky mirrored the turmoil in her heart. She clutched the crumpled address in her hand, her knuckles white. This was it, the potential location of Isabella. The cottage was smaller than she'd imagined, nestled amongst taller, more prosperous neighbors. Climbing the stone steps, she felt a tremor of apprehension. A faded blue door, chipped paint flaking like dried skin, bore the number she sought. Taking a deep breath, she knocked. A moment of silence, stretched taut with anticipation. Then, a shuffling sound, and the door creaked open. An older woman, her face etched with time and worry, peered out. Her eyes, though clouded with age, held a familiar spark. "Clara?" The voice was hesitant, a whisper lost in the wind. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "Isabella?" she breathed, the word a question, a plea. The woman's face crumpled. "Come in, child," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Come in out of the cold." The cottage was small, cozy, smelling faintly of lavender and wood smoke. Sunlight, weak and pale, filtered through the dusty window panes, illuminating a life lived simply, perhaps even sadly. Clara looked around, a silent observer in this stranger's haven. Isabella offered her a chair, her hands trembling slightly as she poured tea. The silence that followed was thick, pregnant with unspoken emotions. Clara watched Isabella's hands, gnarled and lined with age, yet strangely familiar. Finally, Isabella spoke, her voice a low hum against the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. "Your father, he never stopped searching," she said, her gaze distant, lost in memories. "He wrote to me years ago, but I was afraid." Clara nodded, understanding dawning. Fear, guilt, societal pressure, all had kept them apart for so long. "I understand," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. The weight of years of secrets, of lost time, pressed down on them both. The impossible truth had brought them together, yet the path ahead remained unclear, fraught with the challenges of building a relationship forged in sorrow and misunderstanding. The reunion, bittersweet and raw, marked the beginning of a long and arduous journey towards healing. The cottage smelled of lavender and wood smoke, a comforting aroma against the raw grief churning in Clara's stomach. Isabella's hands, gnarled and spotted with age, trembled as she refilled their chipped teacups. Sunlight, weak and watery, painted stripes across the worn wooden floor. Silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the relentless rhythm of the waves crashing against the shore. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions, years of lost connection, a lifetime of regret. Clara watched Isabella, her gaze lingering on the familiar curve of her jaw, the faint lines etching a map of a life lived with quiet strength. The resemblance was undeniable, a mirror reflecting back a part of Clara she hadn't known existed. He never stopped looking for me?" Clara finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the sea's roar. Isabella nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her weathered cheek. "He sent letters year after year, but I was afraid of the scandal, of the pain it would cause you, of everything." Her voice cracked, the words laced with a lifetime of suppressed emotion. "I thought it was best for you to remain unaware, to have a life, a proper life. Clara felt a pang of understanding, a flicker of empathy for the woman who'd made the impossible sacrifice. She saw the weight of her decision in Isabella's tired eyes, the echoes of a love forced into silence. "I understand," Clara breathed, a lump forming in her throat. "But it hurts. It hurts so much to know that I was so close, yet so far away." Isabella reached across the small table, her touch tentative, as if afraid to break a fragile spell. Her hand enveloped Clara's, a silent exchange of comfort and understanding. "It wasn't easy," Isabella confessed, her voice barely a murmur. "But knowing you're here, it makes all the sacrifice worthwhile." A faint smile touched her lips, a fragile bloom against the backdrop of sorrow. The years melted away, replaced by a connection forged in shared loss and newfound hope. The sea still crashed against the shore, but the storm within Clara's heart began to subside, replaced by a fragile dawn of acceptance. The journey ahead remained daunting, but for the first time, Clara wasn't alone. She had found her mother, and in doing so, found a piece of herself she never knew was missing. The sleek, black Mercedes glided through the manicured lawns of Richard's estate, a stark contrast to the ramshackle cottage where Isabella lived. Clara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The impending confrontation with her father loomed, a dark shadow eclipsing the fragile hope she'd found with Isabella. The scent of expensive leather did little to soothe her anxiety. She gripped the cool, polished armrest, her knuckles white. Doubt gnawed at her. Was she doing the right thing? Shattering her meticulously crafted life, revealing the carefully concealed cracks in her seemingly perfect world. It felt like walking a tightrope over a chasm of uncertainty. The fear of her father's reaction, his potential rejection, was a heavy weight on her chest. Yet, the need for truth, for understanding, was a stronger force, a relentless tide pulling her forward. She replayed Isabella's words in her head. "He loved you, Clara, more than anything." The conviction in Isabella's voice had been both heartbreaking and strangely comforting. Could it be true? Could the man who'd seemed so distant, so emotionally unavailable, have harbored such a profound, hidden love? The car pulled up to the imposing gates of the estate. The wrought iron, intricately designed, seemed to symbolize the rigid structure of her life, a life built on secrets and carefully maintained illusions. As the gates swung open, revealing the grand house bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, Clara felt a tremor of apprehension. This was not just a confrontation with her father. It was a confrontation with her past, with the carefully constructed narrative of her own identity. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the storm that was about to break. The journey to the truth had begun, and there was no turning back. The mahogany door, heavy with age and secrets, swallowed Clara whole. The scent of old books and pipe tobacco hung heavy in the air, a familiar yet suffocating fragrance. Richard sat in his leather armchair, a newspaper folded haphazardly in his lap, his usually sharp features softened by a bewildering uncertainty. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting flickering shadows that danced across his face, highlighting the worry lines etched deep around his eyes. "Clara," he began, his voice raspy, a tremor betraying his composure. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers, a mixture of apprehension and something else. "Fear? I received your letter," he said, his gaze dropping to the newspaper again, his hands fidgeting nervously with the edges. I don't understand." Clara's throat constricted. The carefully rehearsed speech she'd prepared crumbled in the face of his vulnerability. "The photo, father," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Isabella, she's my mother." Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hallway. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, years of suppressed emotions bubbling to the surface. Richard looked up, his eyes wide, reflecting the firelight. His face was a mask of shock, quickly replaced by a wave of sorrow that washed over him, leaving him looking utterly defeated. "Isabella?" he breathed, the name a whisper lost in the grand silence of the room. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his gaze distant, lost in memories. I thought she was gone. His voice cracked. Tears welled in his eyes, mirroring the storm raging within Clara's own heart. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing her for the first time, perhaps, not as his daughter, the heir to his fortune, but as a woman, a daughter betrayed, a woman searching for her roots. The weight of his unspoken apologies hung heavy between them. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle. "There's so much you don't know," he said, his voice a low rumble, barely a sound. He paused, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "So much I should have told you years ago." The unspoken words hung between them, a silent promise of a painful but necessary truth. The confrontation had begun, and the carefully constructed walls of their lives began to crumble. The next revelations would be even more shattering. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable. Dust motes danced in the firelight, illuminating the tremor in Richard's hand as he reached for a crystal decanter, his fingers brushing against the cool, smooth glass. He poured himself a generous measure of brandy, the amber liquid sloshing against the sides of the snifter. The clink of glass against glass was sharp in the quiet room. He took a long, slow sip, the liquid burning a path down his throat. "Isabella?" he repeated, the name a sigh escaping his lips. His gaze drifted to a faded photograph on the mantelpiece. A young woman with laughing eyes and a cascade of dark hair, a stark contrast to the steely resolve etched onto Clara's face. The memory, it seemed, was a physical weight upon him, bowing his shoulders, etching deeper the lines around his weary eyes. Clara watched him, her own emotions a turbulent sea. Anger, betrayal, and a desperate longing for understanding warred within her. She'd expected anger, denial, perhaps even a callous dismissal. This unexpected vulnerability was almost worse. It broke down her carefully constructed barriers, leaving her raw and exposed. "I loved her," he whispered, the words barely audible. "More than life itself." He paused, the brandy doing little to soothe the raw edges of his grief. But circumstances, they were impossible. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a sorrow that cut through her, a sorrow that echoed the pain she felt. Impossible. Clara's voice was barely a breath. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken questions. The scent of old leather and wood, usually comforting, now felt suffocating, a physical manifestation of the suffocating truth slowly unfolding. The fire crackled, spitting embers, mirroring the volatile emotions in the room. "Yes," Richard said, his voice raw with regret. "Societal expectations, my family. I thought I was protecting you, protecting her. I was a fool." He stared into the swirling brandy, his reflection a fractured image of a man broken by his own choices. "I made a terrible mistake, Clara. A mistake that has cost me everything." He looked up, his eyes pleading. "Can you ever forgive me?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the silence that preceded it. A silent plea hanging between a father and a daughter, separated by a lifetime of secrets and a lifetime to mend. Clara's silence was a tangible thing, pressing down on the room like a physical weight. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that danced with the dust motes, mirroring the turmoil in her heart. Richard's confession, raw and vulnerable, had shattered her carefully constructed world. The scent of aged leather and polished wood, once comforting, now felt suffocating, a cage built around a painful truth. She stared at her father, his face etched with a sorrow that mirrored her own. The brandy in his hand trembled slightly, the amber liquid a stark contrast to the pallor of his skin. He looked older, suddenly frail, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical burden. "Impossible?" she whispered again, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. The question wasn't merely about the circumstances of Isabella's forced relinquishment. It was about the impossibility of reconciling the man she knew, the distant, yet loving father, with the man who had orchestrated such a devastating betrayal. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the swirling brandy. "My family, their expectations, They would have destroyed both of us, he mumbled, his voice thick with regret. I believed I was protecting you, protecting her, but I only succeeded in destroying everything. He looked up, his eyes pleading, searching for some shred of understanding in her gaze. The years of carefully constructed distance crumbled, revealing a father desperately seeking forgiveness, a father who was, in his own fractured way, heartbroken. Clara saw not just the man who had shattered her life, but a man broken by his own choices, haunted by the ghosts of his past. The anger that had initially consumed her now battled with a bewildering surge of compassion. The impossible truth was not just the existence of Isabella, but the depth of her father's sorrow. A tear escaped, tracing a path down his lined cheek. It was a silent admission of his pain, a silent plea that echoed the storm raging within her own heart. The silence hung heavy once more, broken only by the crackling fire, a relentless rhythm against the backdrop of their unspoken grief. The weight of the years, of secrets and unspoken truths, pressed down, making the air thick and heavy. The question of forgiveness, of reconciliation, hung in the balance, as uncertain as the future that lay before them both. The silence stretched, thick and heavy as the velvet curtains draping the study windows. Dust motes, illuminated by the fire's glow, swirled in the stillness. Richard's confession hung in the air, a miasma of regret and unspoken words. Clara felt the weight of it, a physical pressure on her chest, constricting her breath. The scent of old books and pipe tobacco, once a familiar comfort, now felt suffocating, a tangible symbol of the lies that had defined her life. She rose, the movement slow, deliberate, as if navigating a minefield of shattered expectations. The Persian rug beneath her feet felt strangely soft, a jarring contrast to the harsh reality that had unfolded. She walked to the window, the cold glass a welcome shock against her burning skin. Outside, the city lights glittered, a distant, indifferent spectacle to her inner turmoil. "So," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper, the words catching in her throat. "It wasn't just a fleeting affair?" Richard looked up, his eyes mirroring the flickering flames, revealing the depths of his remorse. "No, Clara, it was a love I foolishly tried to bury, a love that cost me everything." His hand trembled as he reached for his glass, the clinking of ice against crystal a sharp, discordant sound in the otherwise silent room. "But you chose them over us," Clara's voice cracked. The accusation, though unspoken, hung heavy in the air, the them encompassing his family, their expectations, the suffocating weight of societal pressure that had driven him to make such a devastating choice. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I was young, foolish, terrified. I believed I was protecting you both. From the scandal, from the judgment, from a life I thought was unsuitable." He paused, his voice catching. "I was wrong, terribly, horribly wrong." A tear escaped, tracing a slow path down his cheek, leaving a glistening trail through the lines etched by time and regret. The image of her father, usually so stoic, so impeccably composed, now broken and vulnerable, was almost unbearable. It stirred something within her, a strange mixture of anger, sorrow, and a nascent seed of understanding. The impossible truth wasn't just the existence of Isabella, but the depth of her father's self-inflicted pain. The weight of his actions, his regrets, pressed down on him, mirroring her own internal struggle. The silence returned, heavy with unspoken questions, with the weight of years of carefully constructed lies and the terrifying potential for a future yet unknown. The scent of lilies, sharp and cloying, hung in the air, a stark contrast to the musty smell of Richard's study. Clara traced the delicate veins of a porcelain figurine on his desk, its pristine surface a jarring counterpoint to the chaos in her heart. "Tell me about her," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Richard's shoulders slumped, the weight of years visibly crushing him. He picked up a faded photograph, his fingers trembling. It showed a younger Isabella, her smile radiant, her eyes sparkling with a mischievous light. Her laughter, it was like sunlight, he murmured, his voice thick with unshed tears. She had this fire in her, a spirit that refused to be dimmed. He spoke of their whirlwind romance, a forbidden passion blossoming amidst the rigid confines of their society. He described stolen moments, clandestine meetings, the intoxicating thrill of their secret love. He recounted Isabella's resilience, her unwavering devotion, even as societal pressures threatened to tear them apart. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting dancing shadows that mirrored the turmoil in his soul. She was everything, he choked out, his voice breaking. The confession was a slow unraveling, a painful peeling away of layers of deception and self-deception. He spoke of the agonizing decision to give Clara up, the fear, the guilt, the overwhelming despair that had consumed him. "I believed it was for the best," he said, his eyes pleading for understanding. "But the truth is, it was the worst decision of my life." He looked at Clara, his gaze filled with a profound, heartbreaking sorrow. "I lost her, and I lost you." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of unspoken words, a silent acknowledgement of a lifetime of missed opportunities, of a love lost and a family fractured. The truth, raw and brutal, lay exposed between them, illuminating the depths of their shared pain, paving the way for a difficult, yet potentially healing, future. The following morning, the air hung heavy with unspoken words. Sunlight, pale and hesitant, filtered through the tall windows of Richard's study, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stillness. Clara sat stiffly on the worn leather armchair, the scent of old books and leather a muted counterpoint to the turmoil within her. She clutched a chipped porcelain teacup, its warmth failing to reach the icy chill in her heart. Richard sat opposite, his face etched with lines of weariness, his eyes, usually sharp and calculating, now soft with a heartbreaking vulnerability. He reached for a small, tarnished silver locket resting on the desk, its surface scratched and worn with time. "This," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "This was Isabella's." He opened it, revealing a miniature portrait of a young woman with Clara's eyes. A bittersweet smile played on his lips. She always wore it, even after everything. Clara's gaze fell on the miniature, a wave of sorrow washing over her. The resemblance was uncanny, a visual confirmation of the truth she'd already accepted, yet one that still felt surreal. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling. The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation, yet laced with a deeper, more desperate plea for understanding. He sighed, a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "Fear," he confessed, his voice raw with emotion. "Fear of losing you. Fear of the scandal, the judgment of shattering the life I'd built for you." He looked at her, his gaze filled with regret. "I wanted to protect you, Clara, but in doing so, I destroyed something far more precious." The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall. The weight of their unspoken grief was almost tangible, a suffocating blanket of sorrow. Clara felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Anger, betrayal, but also a flicker of pity, a hesitant understanding of the man who was both her father and her betrayer. The pain, however, remained sharp and raw. She needed more answers, needed to understand the circumstances that had ripped her family apart. The truth, she knew, was a jagged, painful path, yet she had to walk it step by agonizing step. The journey to reconciliation, she realized, was just beginning. The scent of lilies, Richard's favorite, hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the bitter taste of betrayal in Clara's mouth. She traced the delicate floral pattern on her teacup, its porcelain cool against her burning fingertips. The study, usually a sanctuary of order and quiet power, felt suffocating, the silence amplifying the unspoken accusations. Richard's confession had cracked open a chasm of pain, revealing the depth of his deception. "It wasn't just fear," he added, his voice breaking slightly. He ran a hand through his thinning silver hair, the gesture revealing the years of unspoken burdens. "There were complications. Isabella's family, They wouldn't have accepted me. They threatened to ruin everything if she didn't give you up. Clara stared at him, her heart a lead weight in her chest. The picture of the young woman in the locket, so heartbreakingly similar to herself, swam before her eyes. She imagined the vibrant Isabella, her spirit crushed by societal constraints, forced to make the most agonizing choice a mother could face. "So you let them?" she whispered, the words laced with a mixture of disbelief and bitter sorrow. The accusation hung between them, thick and heavy, a suffocating shroud. He nodded, unable to meet her gaze, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his confession. "I believed I was protecting you, giving you a life she couldn't provide, a life of privilege and security." His voice trailed off, a pathetic justification for his actions. The afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden rays. Clara felt a strange mix of pity and resentment. She saw the man, the father, ravaged by guilt and regret. Yet, the wound inflicted upon her remained raw and gaping. The truth, brutal and unforgiving, demanded a path forward. Finding Isabella, understanding her mother's story, became not just a quest for answers but a journey towards reconciliation, for herself, for her father, and for the woman who had been denied the right to be her mother. The search began. The dusty attic air hung thick with the scent of mothballs and forgotten dreams. Clara traced the faded script on a brittle, yellowed letter, Isabella's handwriting, elegant and flowing, a stark contrast to the rigid formality of her father's penned replies. Each word whispered a story of stolen moments, clandestine meetings under the cloak of night, a love fiercely guarded against the disapproving gaze of society. The letters detailed a passionate courtship, a blossoming romance ruthlessly severed. Tears blurred the ink, staining the fragile paper with her grief. The weight of her father's betrayal pressed down, a crushing burden. He'd spoken of societal pressures, of family disapproval, but the words felt hollow, a flimsy shield against the raw pain of abandonment. She found a small, worn leather-bound diary tucked within a hidden compartment of the old wooden chest. Isabella's entry for the day Clara was born detailed her joy, her terror, the agonizing decision thrust upon her. Clara read of the heart-wrenching bargain, the desperate plea for her child's future, her love for her daughter a burning ember against the cold reality of her situation. A single, dried rose, pressed between the pages, crumbled in Clara's trembling hand, its faint scent of rose and decay mirroring the bittersweet fragility of her mother's sacrifice. Later, sitting in the hushed grandeur of her father's study, Clara confronted him again. The air vibrated with unspoken tension. Richard, his face etched with lines of regret, nervously adjusted his spectacles. "The money, it was a cruel necessity," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Her family demanded it. They threatened to expose everything, to destroy us both." Clara's voice was tight with unshed tears. "And you gave in? You traded my mother's love for your reputation, your wealth?" He looked up, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "I thought I was protecting you, Clara, giving you a life she couldn't." His words hung in the air, a pathetic attempt at justification. But in the depths of his weary eyes, Clara saw a flicker of something else. The ghost of a love lost, the haunting echo of a decision that had irrevocably altered the course of 3 lives. The understanding, still fragile, began to dawn. It wasn't just about money or reputation. It was a desperate act born out of fear, a misguided attempt at protection that had instead delivered a lifetime of heartache. The crumpled map felt brittle in Clara's hand, its faded ink a testament to time's relentless march. A small, handwritten note, tucked into a creased corner, simply read, "Seabreeze Cottage, Cornwall." The salty tang of the sea air already seemed to cling to her as she booked a flight. The thrill of pursuit mingled with a profound unease. Cornwall, a place so far removed from her gilded cage in London, a place where her life, her very identity, might finally be redefined. The cottage, nestled amongst windswept cliffs overlooking a turbulent sea, was a poignant contrast to her father's mansion. Simple, almost austere, it possessed a quiet dignity, a sense of peace that spoke of lives lived close to nature, far from the clamor of wealth and ambition. A woman tending a small, vibrant garden, her silver hair catching the sunlight, turned as Clara approached. Her eyes, the same startling blue as Clara's, widened in recognition. "Clara?" Isabella's voice was hesitant, laced with a tremor of emotion that mirrored Clara's own. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "Mother?" she whispered, the word foreign yet familiar on her tongue. A revelation both overwhelming and deeply satisfying. Isabella rushed forward, embracing her daughter in a hug that spoke volumes of unspoken years, of a love that had endured despite the cruel hand of fate. The salty air carried the scent of honeysuckle and sea spray, a fragrance that would forever be entwined with this momentous reunion. "My darling girl," Isabella murmured, her voice choked with emotion. "I never stopped hoping." The ensuing hours were a blur of confessions and tears, a weaving together of fragmented memories and long-held secrets. Isabella recounted her story, the youthful passion, the devastating betrayal, the agonizing choice between her love for Clara and the crushing societal pressures that forced her hand. Her voice, though tinged with sorrow, held an unwavering strength, a testament to her enduring spirit. She spoke of her constant, silent love for a daughter she'd never stopped thinking about, of the sacrifices she'd made, each a shard of a broken heart mended only by hope. Clara listened, captivated, feeling her carefully constructed world crumble and rebuild itself around a love she'd never known. A love that felt both ancient and newly born. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep violet, a breathtaking backdrop to a reunion as profound as the ocean before them. In the quiet intimacy of the cottage, bathed in the warm glow of a crackling fire, mother and daughter began to weave a new tapestry of family, a testament to the enduring power of love and the resilience of the human spirit. The cottage, small and snug, hummed with the quiet rhythm of life. The scent of wood smoke and honeysuckle mingled with the salty tang of the sea air, a comforting blend that wrapped around Clara like a warm blanket. Isabella, her face etched with a lifetime of quiet sorrows and enduring strength, poured tea, her hands trembling slightly. The chipped china teacups, relics of a simpler time, felt strangely precious in Clara's hands. "It was a terrible choice," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Her eyes, the same vivid blue as Clara's, were clouded with a mixture of regret and a deep, abiding love. "To give you up, it was the hardest thing I ever did." Clara reached across the small table, her fingers brushing against Isabella's. The contact sent a jolt of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been severed for so long. I don't blame you," Clara managed, her voice thick with emotion. The words felt inadequate, pale in the face of the enormity of Isabella's sacrifice. "Your father, he loved me," Isabella continued, her gaze drifting to the dancing flames. "He was a different man then, before everything changed. He was passionate, reckless, and utterly blind to the consequences of his actions." A single tear traced a path down her weathered cheek. Clara felt a surge of empathy, a connection to the woman who had endured so much for her. This was not the cold, calculating villain she had initially imagined. This was a woman broken by circumstance, a woman who had loved fiercely and lost deeply. The image of her father, the man she had known all her life, shifted subtly in her mind. He, too, was a victim of his own choices, his own limitations. The carefully constructed walls of her privileged life began to crumble, revealing a more complex, more compassionate understanding of her past. The weight of her father's deception remained, but now it was intertwined with a newfound empathy for both her parents, and a growing sense of her own identity beyond her father's wealth. The night deepened, filled with whispered confessions and the silent comfort of shared grief and burgeoning hope. The journey had just begun. The salt-laced wind whipped Clara's hair across her face as she stood before the small, weather-beaten cottage. It was a world away from her father's opulent mansion, a stark contrast mirroring the chasm that had opened in her life. Hesitation gnawed at her, a cold knot in her stomach. She clutched the worn photograph of Isabella, the woman who was both a stranger and her mother. The cottage's single window glowed warmly, a beacon in the gathering dusk. Taking a deep breath, Clara approached, the uneven flagstones crunching under her heels. A hesitant knock echoed in the stillness. The door creaked open, revealing Isabella framed in the amber light. Years had etched lines onto her face, but her eyes, the same vibrant blue as Clara's, held a depth of unshed tears. "Clara," Isabella whispered, her voice a breathy sigh. She reached out, her touch tentative, as if afraid to break a delicate spell. Clara stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and something subtly floral, perhaps lavender. The cottage was simple, sparsely furnished, yet imbued with a sense of quiet comfort. A crackling fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the worn tapestry depicting a scene of serene countryside. I didn't know what to expect," Clara confessed, her voice trembling slightly. The years of carefully constructed distance around her heart seemed to crumble away in the face of Isabella's quiet acceptance. Isabella smiled sadly, a gesture that spoke volumes of unspoken pain and enduring love. "Neither did I, my dear. After all these years," she gestured to a worn armchair by the fire. "Sit, child. Let's talk." The silence that followed was filled with the comforting crackle of the fire, the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, and the unspoken questions hanging heavy in the air between them. Clara watched Isabella, her heart aching with a mixture of joy, sorrow, and the overwhelming weight of a truth finally revealed. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a beginning. The beginning of a relationship forged in years of separation, in secrets and lies, but ultimately, in a shared bloodline and an undeniable love. The journey to understanding had just begun, and the path ahead, though uncertain, felt strangely promising. The cottage smelled of wood smoke and lavender, a comforting contrast to the sterile scent of her father's mansion. Clara sank into the worn armchair, the rough fabric a comforting weight against her skin. Isabella's gaze, a mirror of her own blue eyes, held a lifetime of unspoken stories. A tear traced a path down Isabella's cheek, unnoticed until Clara reached out, gently wiping it away. I don't know where to begin," Clara whispered, her voice catching in her throat. The years of carefully constructed emotional distance felt flimsy, irrelevant in the face of this unexpected intimacy. Isabella smiled, a sad, knowing smile that spoke of sacrifice and enduring love. "Begin anywhere, my dear. There's no right or wrong place to start when piecing together a life shattered and rebuilt." She picked up a chipped teacup, its floral pattern faded with age, and poured them both a steaming cup of herbal tea. The steam curled around their faces, a fragile bridge between them. "Your father," Clara began, the words catching in her throat. The name, once a symbol of wealth and security, now felt heavy with betrayal and unspoken pain. Isabella's hand tightened around her cup. "He loved me, Clara, more than he ever knew. But his world, it was a world that couldn't comprehend our love. He thought he was protecting me, protecting you." Her voice trembled, a mixture of sorrow and resignation. The fire crackled, a counterpoint to the quiet sobs that escaped her. Clara reached across the small table, her fingers brushing Isabella's. The simple touch sparked a current, a silent acknowledgement of shared pain and a burgeoning connection. He told me he never knew about you." Isabella nodded, her eyes glistening. "He believed he was protecting you from the scandal, from the judgment of society. He didn't understand the depth of his own actions, the pain he inflicted on both of us. The truth was buried, a wound festering in silence. The silence hung heavy in the air, punctuated only by the crackling fire and the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Clara felt a wave of empathy, a sudden understanding that transcended the anger and betrayal. This wasn't a villain and a victim. This was a story of love, loss, and the devastating consequences of societal constraints. The journey towards understanding and reconciliation had only just begun. The cottage, nestled amongst whispering willows, felt less like a refuge and more like a fragile ecosystem. Clara, surrounded by the scent of wood smoke and lavender, felt the weight of her newfound reality settle heavily on her shoulders. Days bled into weeks, each sunrise painting the same hesitant hope across the weathered walls. The initial shock was slowly giving way to a tentative acceptance, though the chasm between her past life and this new, uncertain future still felt vast. "It's different," Clara admitted one evening, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames in the hearth. Isabella, her hands calloused from years of gardening, sat beside her, a gentle warmth radiating from her. "Different how, my dear?" Isabella asked, her voice soft as the rustling leaves outside. "Everything. The silence, the space. At home it was always loud, full of people, noise, expectations." Clara shivered, not entirely from the cool evening air. "Here it's quiet, peaceful, but lonely sometimes." Isabella reached for Clara's hand, her touch surprisingly strong. "Loneliness is a different kind of silence, isn't it? A silence that speaks of absence, not peace. We'll fill that silence, together. It will take time, my love, but we will." The words, simple yet profound, resonated deeply within Clara. The following days were filled with quiet moments. Shared meals around a worn oak table, walks through sun-dappled fields, and countless cups of tea. Clara found herself opening up, revealing vulnerabilities she'd kept tightly guarded for years. She spoke of her feelings of betrayal, the confusion, the anger emotions she hadn't allowed herself to fully process until now. Isabella listened patiently, her empathy a constant balm to Clara's wounds. There were still moments of awkwardness, of unspoken questions hanging in the air, but they were gradually being replaced by a burgeoning sense of connection, a tentative trust slowly blooming in the fertile ground of their shared history. The pieces of their fractured lives, once scattered and broken, were beginning to fit together, revealing a picture far more intricate and beautiful than Clara could have ever imagined. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Clara felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile promise of healing. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth clung to Clara's clothes as she walked back to the cottage, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the overgrown path. A robin's song, sharp and clear, pierced the quiet. The peace of Isabella's cottage, once a haven, now felt heavy with unspoken anxieties. She'd spent the morning helping Isabella tend her garden, the rhythmic digging a counterpoint to the turmoil within her. The physical exertion had done little to soothe the persistent ache in her chest. "Something troubles you," Isabella said, her voice soft as she joined Clara by the cottage door. The wrinkles around her eyes, etched by time and hardship, spoke volumes. Clara hesitated, the weight of her revelation pressing down. "It's father," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He's not coping. He's withdrawn, haunted." She traced the chipped paint on the doorframe, her fingers trembling. Isabella's hand covered hers, her touch firm but gentle. "He bears a heavy burden, my dear, but grief, like love, demands a space to breathe." Her eyes held a depth of understanding that both comforted and unsettled Clara. The following days were a blur of tearful phone calls, strained conversations, and the slow, agonizing process of Richard's reluctant acceptance of his past. His guilt was a palpable thing, suffocating the air in their conversations. He'd built an empire on a foundation of lies, and the edifice was crumbling. "I destroyed everything," he confessed one evening, his voice thick with sorrow, his words tumbling over each other. "I lost you, Isabella, and I almost lost Clara. I don't deserve either of you." Clara's heart ached for him. His remorse was genuine, the pain etched onto his weary face. Yet, forgiveness remained a distant shore, its sands still shimmering beyond her reach. The hurt ran too deep, the betrayal too profound. She knew understanding was possible, perhaps even compassion, but complete forgiveness? That remained an uncertain future. The weight of her newfound family, the fragile bonds she was attempting to forge with a mother she'd never known and a father forever scarred by his mistakes, threatened to overwhelm her. She loved them both, fiercely and desperately, yet the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. The quiet of the cottage, once a source of comfort, now felt like a mirror reflecting her internal chaos. Healing, she realized, would be a long, arduous process. A process that required not only forgiveness, but also the courage to redefine her own identity, separate from the privileged life she'd once taken for granted. The journey had just begun. The cottage, nestled amongst whispering pines, felt less like a refuge and more like a pressure cooker. The scent of lavender from Isabella's garden, usually soothing, now felt cloying, mirroring the suffocating guilt hanging over Richard. Clara watched him, his usually sharp features softened by a weariness that went beyond age. He sat on the porch swing, the rhythmic creak a counterpoint to his inner turmoil. "Clara," he began, his voice raspy, I don't know how to make amends." He looked up at her, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. The sunlight glinted off the silver in his temples, highlighting the lines etched by years of unspoken regret. Clara sat beside him, the rough wood of the swing digging into her thighs. "It's not about amends, Papa," she said softly, her voice catching in her throat. "It's about understanding." The silence stretched, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets. Isabella emerged from the cottage, a steaming mug in her hand. The warmth radiating from the mug seemed a small offering against the coldness between father and daughter. She placed it in Clara's hand, a silent gesture of comfort. "He needs time, my dear," Isabella murmured, her voice low and soothing. She looked at Richard, her expression a mixture of compassion and sorrow. Time to grieve for what was lost, and time to hope for what may be. Clara sipped the tea, the herbal infusion a balm against the turmoil in her soul. The warmth spread through her, but the chill of betrayal lingered. She understood his regret. She saw the pain behind his remorse, yet the act of forgiveness felt like scaling a mountain, each step uphill a painful struggle against the gravity of her hurt. The next few days were a slow, agonizing process of tentative steps toward reconciliation. They talked, or rather, they stumbled through conversations laced with unspoken emotions and half-formed sentences. The atmosphere remained thick with unspoken feelings, a suffocating weight. Each attempt at understanding was fraught with the risk of reopening old wounds. Yet, amidst the struggle, a fragile hope flickered. A hope born not from ignoring the past, but from acknowledging it, from facing the harsh truths and the messy complexities of family. The journey to forgiveness remained long and arduous, a winding road paved with sorrow, but Clara, guided by the quiet strength of her mother and the remorse of her father, knew she was not alone on this path. The cottage kitchen, fragrant with cinnamon and brewing coffee, felt oddly comforting. Clara, perched on a worn wooden stool, watched Isabella knead bread dough, her hands moving with a practiced grace. The rhythmic thudding was a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil in Clara's heart. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a silent ballet mirroring the uncertainty in her soul. "It's different," Clara finally said, her voice barely a whisper. The confession hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. Isabella stopped kneading, her gaze soft. "Different is good, Cara," she replied, her voice laced with a gentle understanding that surprised Clara. "It means we're building something new, something real." Clara nodded slowly, picking at a loose thread on her jeans. The weight of her past, the privileged life, the detached father, the shocking revelation, felt less crushing now, diluted by the warmth of Isabella's presence. Yet, the chasm of years, the absence of a mother's love, still echoed within her. "I keep expecting, I don't know," Clara mumbled, her eyes filling with tears, "to wake up." The words were a confession of her own disbelief, a desperate clinging to the familiarity of the life she knew. Isabella approached, her touch gentle as she placed a comforting hand on Clara's arm. "There's no waking up from this, my love. This is real. This is us." Her eyes, mirroring the warmth of the morning sun, held a depth of unwavering affection that both comforted and overwhelmed Clara. The unspoken words of forgiveness, acceptance, the tentative beginnings of a bond forged across years of separation, hung between them, a silent promise of something new. The scent of baking bread mingled with the fragrance of lavender, creating a comforting aroma that promised healing, a balm to a wounded soul. The journey to reconciliation was far from over, but in this small cottage kitchen, bathed in the morning light, Clara felt, for the first time, a glimmer of hope, a fragile, precious seed of acceptance blooming in the fertile ground of her heart. The mahogany desk in Richard's study felt alien to Clara now. Dust motes, illuminated by the afternoon sun slicing through the tall windows, swirled in the silence, a poignant reminder of the years she'd spent in this house, unaware of the truth. The air, heavy with the scent of old leather and polished wood, held a ghost of her father's presence, a presence now tainted by betrayal. She picked up a silver pen, its weight familiar, yet strangely cold in her hand. It felt like a relic from a life that no longer existed. She had called him that morning. The conversation had been stilted, awkward, punctuated by long silences filled with unspoken accusations and regrets. Richard's voice, usually booming with authority, had been a low tremor, choked with remorse. I never meant to hurt you, Clara," he'd stammered, his words clumsy and inadequate. The apology, though heartfelt, felt insufficient, a flimsy bandage on a gaping wound. Clara traced the engraved initials on the pen, a symbol of a life she'd been denied. "I need to understand," she'd said, her voice tight with unshed tears. "I need to know why." Richard had fallen silent, the silence a heavier weight than any explanation he could offer. He had promised to meet her later that week, to face her in person and share his story. The prospect filled her with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. She placed the pen back on the desk, the metallic click echoing in the vast emptiness of the room. The memory of Isabella's embrace lingered, a warmth that contrasted sharply with the chilling emptiness of her father's study. Isabella's cottage, though small and humble, radiated a sense of warmth, a haven. The scent of freshly baked bread, of lavender and wood smoke, had seeped into Clara's skin, a comforting counterpoint to the sterile, opulent atmosphere of her childhood home. In Isabella's embrace, Clara felt a connection, a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. But the path to healing, she knew, wouldn't be easy. It would require forgiveness, both of her father and of herself, a monumental task that seemed to stretch before her like an endless, winding road. The road ahead promised a journey filled with pain and uncertainty, yet also with the faintest glimmer of hope, a new dawn breaking through the stormy clouds of her past. Richard's impending confession felt like a crucial step, a turning point on that long, difficult journey. The scent of wood smoke and lavender still clung to Clara's clothes, a comforting reminder of Isabella's embrace. Driving back to her father's mansion, the opulent architecture seemed to mock her newfound vulnerability. The meticulously manicured lawns, once symbols of her privileged life, now felt sterile, alien. Inside, the silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a relentless reminder of time slipping away, of the years lost, of truths concealed. That evening, Richard arrived. He looked older, smaller, the imposing figure Clara had known seemingly shrunk under the weight of his confession. He sat heavily in the plush armchair, his hands clasped tightly, his gaze avoiding hers. "Clara," he began, his voice a worn whisper, "there's so much I wish I could take back." Clara remained silent, her heart a clenched fist in her chest. The years of emotional distance, the carefully constructed walls of her privileged life, crumbled before the raw pain of his words. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but all she could manage was a quiet, "Why? Isabella." "She was everything," he confessed, his voice cracking. "We were young, foolish. The scandal, it would have ruined everything." He paused, his eyes filling with tears. "I was selfish, Clara, terribly selfish." "And what about her?" Clara's voice was barely a breath. What about the pain you inflicted on her, on me? The anger simmered beneath the surface, a volcanic force threatening to erupt. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. I know I caused you immense pain. I only ask for your understanding, your forgiveness. His voice trembled. The image of the young, vibrant Isabella from the photograph flashed in Clara's mind, a stark contrast to the defeated man sitting before her. Clara met his gaze, the anger slowly giving way to a cautious empathy. The years of emotional deprivation, the carefully constructed facade of her life, began to crumble, replaced by a deep-seated longing for connection, for understanding. The silence that followed was profound, a heavy blanket woven from regret and a nascent hope. The road to reconciliation, she realized, was a long and arduous one, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could begin to walk it together. The following days were a blur of hesitant steps and tentative conversations. The grand mansion felt less like a gilded cage and more like a mausoleum of unspoken words. Clara found solace in the small, sun-drenched sitting room, the scent of old books and leather a comfort against the echoing silence of the larger rooms. She traced the delicate floral pattern on the antique wallpaper, its faded colors mirroring the fragility of her own newly discovered past. Richard, humbled and subdued, tried to bridge the chasm that separated them. He brought her tea, brewed with chamomile and honey, a gesture both clumsy and heartfelt. He spoke of Isabella, his voice laced with a sorrow that resonated with Clara's own grief. She loved music, he murmured, his eyes distant, played the piano beautifully. One evening, he showed her a battered music box, its delicate melody a poignant echo of a love lost. The tiny ballerina twirled, her porcelain features mirroring the fragility of their shared history. Clara touched the box gently, the smooth wood warm beneath her fingertips. The music, a bittersweet waltz, seemed to fill the room with an unspoken apology. I never knew, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the music, that she was my mother, that you loved her. Richard looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and profound sadness. I was a fool, Clara, a selfish, arrogant fool. Society, my family, they wouldn't have understood. He paused, then added softly, but I loved her more than anything in the world. The weight of his confession hung heavy in the air, the silence punctuated only by the gentle tinkling of the music box. Clara reached out, her hand covering his. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a tentative step toward understanding, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of years and unspoken truths. The touch, though hesitant, carried the weight of unspoken emotions, a nascent understanding blooming amid the ruins of their past. The music faded, leaving behind a poignant silence, a space where healing could, perhaps, begin. The scent of chamomile lingered in the air, a faint promise of reconciliation. The weight of his confession settled heavily on Clara, a tangible presence in the room. The scent of chamomile, once soothing, now felt cloyingly sweet, a stark contrast to the bitter taste of betrayal lingering on her tongue. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, a serene picture at odds with the storm raging within her. She withdrew her hand, the silence stretching, taut and uncomfortable. Richard rose, pacing the room like a caged animal. His normally impeccably tailored suit seemed to hang loosely on his frame, emphasizing his sudden fragility. I tried to find her, he said, his voice a low rasp. After she left, but she vanished. It was years before I even suspected that she might have a child. Clara stared at the worn Persian rug beneath her feet, the intricate pattern blurring through her tears. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered, the question choked with a lifetime of unspoken grievances. He stopped pacing, his shoulders slumped. Fear, Clara. Fear of losing everything. My reputation, my business, even you. I was a coward. He ran a hand through his silver hair, the gesture betraying a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. I built this life, this gilded cage, and I was too afraid to risk it all. The unspoken accusation hung in the air, You sacrificed me." The thought was a sharp, physical pain, a wound that years of privilege couldn't mask. He approached her again, his movements hesitant, apologetic. "I never stopped loving Isabella. Never." His voice cracked, "And the thought that I might have lost you both, it almost broke me." He paused, his gaze searching hers, pleading for understanding. Can you possibly understand that?" Clara looked at her father, truly looked at him for the first time, seeing not the distant, powerful figure who had shaped her life, but a broken, grieving man. The image was jarring, disorienting. His vulnerability, stark and unexpected, chipped away at the wall of resentment she'd built. The anger hadn't vanished, but it was now tinged with a strange, unsettling empathy. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely a breath. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, but I think I can try to understand." The words felt small, inadequate in the face of the immense chasm that still separated them, but they were a start. A fragile first step towards a future she couldn't yet comprehend. A future where reconciliation might, just might, be possible. The music box lay silent, its ballerina frozen in a perpetual twirl, a poignant symbol of a love story both beautiful and devastating. The faded sepia photograph felt strangely warm in Clara's hands. It depicted a young Isabella, her mother, laughing, her face radiant, her arm entwined with a younger Richard, his eyes alight with a passion that starkly contrasted with the reserved man she knew. The image was a ghost, a whisper of a life lived in secret, a life that had irrevocably shaped her own. The antique music box, still silent after her father's confession, felt heavy with unspoken regrets. A montage of memories flooded Clara's mind. Stolen glances across crowded rooms, the hushed tones of clandestine meetings, the scent of lilies of the valley, Isabella's favorite, lingering faintly in the air of her father's study. Even now, these fragments, once insignificant details, now blazed with significance, each one a piece of a puzzle she'd only just begun to assemble. It was a painful puzzle, its edges jagged with betrayal and loss. "He loved her," she whispered, more to herself than to the empty room. The words hung in the air, heavy with a mix of grief and a strange, nascent understanding. The anger, though still present, felt dulled, softened at the edges by a burgeoning empathy. She pictured them, young and reckless, defying societal expectations, their love a burning flame against the backdrop of a rigid, unforgiving world. Their laughter, their whispered secrets, the stolen kisses, all vivid, poignant images conjured from fragments of letters and faded photographs. Richard's words echoed in her mind. Fear, Clara, fear of losing everything. He had been afraid, consumed by a fear that had driven him to make choices that had shattered lives. But behind that fear, she now saw, was a profound love, a love that had been buried under layers of guilt and regret. Was it enough to forgive him? The question remained unanswered, a knot of uncertainty tightening in her chest. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the room. The air grew colder, a tangible shift mirroring the emotional chill that settled over Clara. Yet, in the midst of the emotional turmoil, a tiny spark of hope flickered. She had found her mother. She had a past, a history richer and more complex than she had ever imagined. And perhaps, just perhaps, she might find a way to build a future from the shattered pieces of the past. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope amidst the ruins. The silent ballerina in the music box seemed to watch her, a tiny, silent witness to a long, arduous journey towards understanding, forgiveness, and reconciliation. The scent of old paper and dust still clung to Clara's clothes as she left her father's study, the weight of revelation pressing down on her. Outside, the manicured lawns of the estate seemed oddly alien, the vibrant colors muted by the storm raging within her. She found Isabella sitting on a secluded bench by the lily pond, the same lilies of the valley her father had mentioned, their delicate perfume a bittersweet reminder of a love lost and found. Isabella looked up, her eyes mirroring the confusion and sorrow etched on Clara's face. "He told you," she said, her voice barely a whisper, a soft sigh escaping her lips. Clara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "He loved you," she managed, finally, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "With a love that burned brighter than the sun," Isabella replied, a faint smile playing on her lips, a bittersweet memory dancing in her eyes. But it was a love shadowed by fear, a fear that choked the life out of it. She traced a fallen petal with a trembling finger. "He was afraid of losing everything, wasn't he?" "He was," Clara agreed, the echo of her father's words reverberating in her ears. The image of the young Richard in the photograph, his eyes shining with passion, flashed before her eyes, a stark contrast to the man she knew. A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words, with shared grief and dawning understanding. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the water, the reflected light shimmering like shattered pieces of a dream. The air grew colder, a tangible shift reflecting the emotional chill clinging to them both. Yet, a tentative warmth began to bloom between them, a fragile bud of connection pushing through the frozen earth of years of separation. Isabella reached out, her hand covering Clara's, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. "He never stopped loving you, my darling," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Never." The weight on Clara's chest eased slightly, the sharp edges of her anger softening. The understanding began to dawn, that this wasn't a simple tale of betrayal but a tragic symphony of fear, love, and loss. The pain remained, sharp and undeniable, but now it was interwoven with a surprising tenderness, a newfound connection bridging a lifetime of separation. It was the beginning, she realized, a tentative first step on a long and winding path toward healing, toward forgiveness, toward a future they never imagined. The old photo album lay open on Isabella's lap, its brittle pages filled with faded images of a vibrant, passionate young couple. Richard, his eyes alight with a love that transcended the formal attire, and Isabella, radiant even in black and white, their laughter echoing silently across the years. The scent of lilies of the valley, a faint perfume clinging to the aged paper, filled the air, a poignant reminder of a love brutally severed. Clara, watching them, felt a pang of something akin to jealousy, a fierce longing for a past she'd never known. "He used to bring me these," Isabella murmured, her voice catching in her throat, tracing a wilted flower pressed between two pages. "He'd say they smelled of hope." Clara reached out, her fingers brushing against the delicate petals. The image of her father, the stern, distant man she knew, seemed a million miles away from the laughing young man in the photograph. The chasm between them, once a gaping wound of betrayal, began to soften at the edges. "He loved you so much," Clara whispered, the words a discovery both for Isabella and herself. A single tear escaped Isabella's eye, tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. "It was a love born of stolen moments," she said, her voice low and husky with the weight of years, "of clandestine meetings and whispered promises. A love that dared not speak its name." The fire in the hearth crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cozy cottage, a stark contrast to the cold, echoing halls of her father's mansion. Clara felt a sense of belonging here, a warmth she'd never experienced before. This wasn't just a mother she was meeting. She was finding a home. "He was afraid," Clara said, the understanding dawning slowly, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "Afraid of losing everything." Isabella nodded, a deep sigh escaping her lips. "He built his empire on a foundation of lies, my dear, and his love for me became the most dangerous secret of all." The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with a shared history, a mutual understanding of loss and regret. It was a silence that spoke volumes, bridging the gap between a daughter and a mother separated by circumstances beyond their control. The flickering firelight danced on their faces, reflecting the dawning hope in their eyes, a glimmer of healing in the shadows of the past. The journey would be long, but they were together, taking the first steps towards reconciliation, towards a future built on a foundation of truth and love. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows on the antique furniture, illuminating dust motes swirling in the warm air of Richard's study. Clara traced the ornate carvings on the desk. The polished wood cool beneath her fingertips. It was a stark contrast to the rough-hewn table in Isabella's cottage. Memories flickered. Isabella's laughter, the scent of lilies of the valley, the weight of her mother's hand in hers. "He wrote to her every day," Isabella had said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Even when he was building his empire, even when he married your mother." Clara pictured it now. The clandestine letters, the stolen moments, the desperate yearning in his eyes reflected in the old photographs. The image of Richard, the powerful, unyielding man she knew, shattered into 1,000 fragments, revealing a passionate, vulnerable soul beneath. He'd built his success on a foundation of lies, a monument to his unspoken love for Isabella, a testament to his crippling fear. A framed portrait of a younger Richard hung above the fireplace, his eyes mirroring a youthful hopefulness Clara had never seen in him. He smiled faintly, a ghost of the man Isabella described, the man who'd held his love for her close to his heart, a secret guarded with his very life. The weight of his silence, his avoidance, and his carefully constructed life pressed upon her. It was a suffocating burden she had carried for so long, an inheritance of lies. The scent of old leather and aged paper filled the air, a tangible reminder of his deception, yet a strange comfort now. It was the scent of his life, his secrets, and it no longer felt entirely foreign or hostile. It was a part of her history, a legacy of both pain and unexpected love. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold frame, a silent acknowledgement of his hidden pain, his impossible love, the cost of his choices. The past, once a painful mystery, was slowly revealing itself. With each shared memory, each whispered confession, the chasm between Clara and her father began to close, not by erasing the past, but by acknowledging it, understanding it, and even, dare she hope, forgiving it. The fire crackled again, a counterpoint to the quiet sigh that escaped her lips, a breath of acceptance in the face of overwhelming revelation. The journey towards reconciliation had just begun. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth clung to Isabella's clothes as she sat across from Clara, a steaming mug warming her hands. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills. "He never stopped loving me," Isabella whispered, her voice raspy with emotion. A single tear traced a path through the fine lines etched around her eyes, a testament to years of unspoken sorrow. "Even after he married your mother." Clara nodded, understanding dawning slowly. The chasm between the idealized image of her father and the flawed man revealed in Isabella's words felt both vast and strangely intimate. The polished mahogany of Richard's study, the stark contrast to Isabella's humble cottage, mirrored the jarring disconnect between the two lives. "He told me he couldn't risk losing everything," Isabella continued, her gaze drifting to the distant horizon. "His family, his ambitions. He believed he was protecting me, protecting you." Her voice cracked, the words tinged with a lifetime of regret. "Protecting me by tearing me away from you?" Clara's voice was barely a breath, a question laced with pain and a burgeoning sense of empathy. She saw it now, the impossible choices, the agonizing sacrifices made in the name of love and duty. The weight of Richard's actions, once a crushing burden of betrayal, now felt strangely understandable. Not justifiable, certainly not forgivable yet, but understandable. Isabella reached across the small table, her touch hesitant but gentle, covering Clara's hand. "He loved you fiercely, Clara, more than words can say. He didn't know how to show it." A quiet settled between them, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the gathering dusk. Clara squeezed Isabella's hand, a silent acknowledgement of the shared pain, the shared history, the complex tapestry of love and loss woven between them and the man they both loved. The cold, hard truth was softening, giving way to a tentative understanding, a fragile bridge built across a lifetime of secrets. The journey to forgiveness was long, but for the first time, Clara felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile sense of peace amidst the wreckage of the past. The weight on her chest lessened, replaced by a nascent understanding, a seed of empathy taking root in the fertile ground of grief. The following weeks were a blur of hushed conversations, stolen glances, and tentative steps towards understanding. Clara found herself drawn to Isabella's small cottage, a world away from her father's opulent mansion. The air here, thick with the scent of baking bread and wood smoke, felt comforting, a stark contrast to the sterile elegance of her former life. Isabella's hands, roughened by years of work, held a gentle strength that mirrored the resilience in her spirit. They spent hours talking, piecing together the fragments of their shared history. "He used to sing to me," Isabella revealed one evening, her voice catching. "Old lullabies, the same ones he sang to you. A shared memory, a phantom echo of a love that had been denied, bridged the years of separation." Clara felt a pang of bittersweet longing. She imagined a younger Isabella, humming those same lullabies to a baby Clara, a scene painted in soft hues of warmth and tenderness. One rainy afternoon, huddled by the fire, Clara asked the question that had haunted her. "Why didn't you fight for me?" Isabella's gaze met hers, unwavering. "Richard's family, they would have destroyed me. They would have taken everything." The words hung heavy in the air, a chilling testament to the societal pressures that had forced Isabella's silence. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on Isabella's face, highlighting the years etched into her features, a roadmap of sacrifices made, a silent testament to a love both fierce and enduring. Clara's heart ached for the woman sitting across from her, a woman who had borne the brunt of her father's mistakes, yet carried no bitterness, only a quiet sorrow. That evening, as the rain lashed against the windows, Clara felt a shift within herself. The anger, the betrayal, still lingered, but it was slowly being eroded by a burgeoning sense of empathy, a dawning understanding of the impossible choices her parents had faced. The journey to forgiveness wouldn't be easy, but with each shared story, each quiet moment of connection, the chasm between them seemed to shrink, replaced by a fragile, yet growing, bond of love and understanding. The scent of old leather and pipe tobacco still clung to Richard's study, a phantom reminder of the life Clara had once known. Now, surrounded by Isabella, the air held a different fragrance, the delicate sweetness of lilies, a favorite of her mother's. Clara watched Isabella's hands, calloused yet deft, carefully arrange photographs on the antique desk. Each image, a fragment of a past both familiar and alien, stirred a fresh wave of emotion. "He always loved lilies," Isabella murmured, her voice soft, barely audible above the crackling fireplace. A single tear traced a path down her weathered cheek. "Even when we couldn't afford them." Clara reached across the space separating them, her own hand covering Isabella's. The warmth of her mother's touch sent a shiver of recognition down her spine, a primal connection that transcended years of separation. I wish I could have known you then," Clara whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. The weight of unspoken years hung heavy between them. Isabella squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of the shared loss. "I wish it too, my darling, but things were different then. My love for you was my strength, but it was also my prison." The crackling fire cast dancing shadows on Isabella's face, highlighting the lines of worry etched around her eyes, the subtle tremor in her hands. It was a face that spoke of hardship, sacrifice, and a love that had endured even amidst the deepest sorrow. The silence that followed was not awkward, but filled with unspoken understanding. It was the silence of shared pain, a testament to the profound bond that had finally been forged. Looking at the faded photographs, Clara felt a shift in her perspective. The bitterness and anger were still there, but they were gradually being supplanted by a tentative hope, a fragile blossoming of compassion. "He loved you," Clara said, her voice barely a breath. The words, addressed to her mother, were also a quiet acknowledgement of her father's deep, albeit flawed, love. Isabella nodded, her eyes mirroring the flickering flames. "And I loved him with all my heart." Even when she trailed off, unable to articulate the pain of their cruel separation, Clara knew she had a long way to go, a long journey of healing and reconciliation. But in that quiet moment, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, a new chapter had begun, a path toward a future where love, rather than loss, would finally prevail. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Isabella's small cottage, painting dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of lavender and freshly baked bread mingled, a comforting contrast to the heaviness in Clara's heart. Isabella, perched on a worn armchair, knitted a vibrant scarf, her nimble fingers a blur of motion. The rhythmic click of the needles provided a strangely soothing counterpoint to the turmoil within Clara. "He wasn't a monster, you know?" Isabella said softly, her gaze fixed on her work. Clara flinched. The statement felt both too forgiving and painfully accurate. "But he hurt you," Clara whispered, the words catching in her throat. She picked at a loose thread on the armchair's tapestry, avoiding her mother's eyes. The guilt gnawed at her, guilt for the anger she still harbored, guilt for the privileged life that had been built on a foundation of lies. Isabella sighed, setting down her knitting. "He was a product of his time, Clara, bound by expectations, by fear. He loved me in his own way, a way that was constrained." She looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "But his love for you, that was unconditional, even if he couldn't show it the way he should have." Clara met her mother's gaze, a flicker of something akin to acceptance stirring within her. The years of carefully constructed walls around her heart began to crumble, replaced by a hesitant, fragile hope. The memory of her father, the aloof millionaire, shifted, revealing a flawed but deeply human figure. The man who had unwittingly loved his own daughter through another woman. The man who would have done anything to prevent the pain caused by this impossible secret. "It's hard to reconcile," Clara murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "The man I knew, the man in the photographs, they seem like different people entirely." Isabella nodded, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "He was a man caught between two loves, my darling. Two loves he could never truly reconcile. And he paid the price for that." She reached across the space separating them, her hand resting warmly on Clara's. "But you, my child, you are the bridge. You are the way back to what could have been." The weight of unspoken words still hung heavy in the air, but it felt different now. Lighter, less suffocating. A path, however uncertain, was beginning to emerge from the wreckage of their fractured past. The understanding, tentative and fragile, was a seed of forgiveness, nurtured by love. The news rippled through Clara's meticulously ordered world like a seismic tremor. The whispers started subtly, concerned glances from staff, hushed conversations in hallways, a sudden hesitancy in the usual deference. The impact on her life, once a seamless tapestry of privilege, was starting to unravel. Her carefully curated image, the daughter of a renowned businessman, felt like a flimsy mask about to shatter. The opulent penthouse suite, usually a sanctuary, felt suffocating. Sunlight glinted off the polished marble floors, but the light couldn't penetrate the growing gloom in Clara's heart. She paced, the soft carpet muffling her restless footsteps. The weight of the revelation, her father's secret, her mother's sacrifice, pressed down, heavy and inescapable. "What do I do?" she whispered, the question lost in the vast emptiness of the room. A knock on the door startled her. It was her longtime personal assistant, Eleanor, her face etched with concern. "Miss Clara," Eleanor began softly, "there's been a lot of calls about your father's business. The board, they're worried." Clara felt a chill crawl up her spine. The whispers weren't just social anxieties. They were financial tremors. The business, Richard's legacy, the very foundation of her privileged existence, was teetering on the edge. "What are they saying?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. Eleanor hesitated. "They're questioning his judgment, the revelations. They're worried about the public perception." Eleanor's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The scandal threatened not just Richard's reputation, but Clara's future, too. The security, the comfort, the lifestyle she had always known was slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. Clara sank onto a plush velvet chaise lounge, the softness offering little comfort. The weight of her father's actions, the legacy of lies, was crushing her. She thought of Isabella, her mother, her strength, her resilience. A new resolve flickered within her. This wasn't just about her father. It was about her own life, her own choices. She wouldn't be defined by her father's mistakes. She would forge her own path, and maybe, just maybe, in the process, she would create something stronger, something truer than what had been lost. A hesitant smile touched her lips. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The mahogany boardroom felt colder than usual. Clara sat rigidly, the polished surface reflecting the strained faces around the table. The air hummed with unspoken accusations. "Miss Cartwright," a sharp voice cut through the silence. "Your father's indiscretions are impacting investor confidence." The words hung, heavy and suffocating. Clara's fingers tightened around her water glass, the ice clinking a brittle counterpoint to the simmering tension. "I understand," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She met the gaze of the CEO, a man whose usually jovial face was etched with worry. "My father's actions were regrettable, but I assure you, the Cartwright Group remains financially sound." A lie she knew, but a necessary one. The truth, the shattered family, the public scandal would only deepen the crisis. Later, in the quiet solitude of her apartment, the facade crumbled. Tears streamed down her face, hot and relentless, blurring the city lights glittering below. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of privilege, now felt like a gilded cage. The weight of responsibility pressed down her father's legacy, her mother's past, her own uncertain future. She picked up the phone, her hand trembling. "Isabella," she whispered, the name a lifeline in the storm. The connection crackled to life. Isabella's voice, warm and comforting, was a balm to her raw emotions. "Clara? My darling, what is it?" The concern in her voice was palpable. Clara poured out her heart, the words tumbling out in a torrent of emotion. The business turmoil, the societal judgment, the fear of losing everything. Isabella listened patiently, her voice a steady anchor in the maelstrom. "It's not your fault, my love," Isabella reassured her. "This is your father's doing, and you don't have to bear this burden alone." A quiet strength settled over Clara as she listened. Isabella's words were like a gentle hand guiding her through the darkness. They talked for hours, sharing stories, memories, and hopes. The shared pain forged a bond stronger than blood, a testament to the enduring power of love and resilience. For the first time since the revelation, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. The fight was far from over, but she wasn't facing it alone. She had her mother, and that, she realized, was everything. The scent of old paper and leather clung to the air in Clara's apartment, a stark contrast to the sterile, modern scent of her father's office. She traced the rim of a chipped teacup, the delicate porcelain cool against her fingertips. The weight of the past few weeks pressed down, heavier than any business deal. Outside, the city roared, a symphony of distant sirens and honking taxis, a muted backdrop to the storm raging within her. She thought of the board meeting, the cold stares, the veiled accusations. Isabella's voice, a lifeline in the chaos, echoed in her memory. "It's not your fault, my love." But the words, while comforting, didn't fully erase the fear gnawing at her. The Cartwright Group, her father's legacy, teetered on the brink. Her carefully constructed life, once a testament to privilege, was crumbling. The phone buzzed, startling her. It was her lawyer. "Miss Cartwright." His voice was tight, laced with professional concern. "The investors are growing increasingly restless. They're demanding answers. They want a scapegoat." A bitter laugh escaped Clara's lips. Scapegoat. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Her father's actions were the catalyst, but she was the one bearing the brunt. The weight of the family's secrets threatened to crush her. She felt a sharp pang of guilt, a familiar ache for a father she both loved and resented. "I understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The lawyer's words, the threat of financial ruin, the social ostracization, added another layer to her already overwhelming burden. But then she thought of Isabella's steady hand, the unwavering support, and a new resolve ignited within her. "I need time," Clara said, her voice gathering strength, "to formulate a response, to protect what matters most." She hung up, a quiet determination settling over her. She wouldn't be a scapegoat. She would fight for her family, for her future, for the truth, no matter the cost. The fight had begun, and she would not yield. The gilded cage might be shaking, but she was finding her wings. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath her fingertips, the polished surface reflecting the harsh glare of the city lights. Clara traced the intricate carvings, each curve a silent testament to a life she no longer fully understood. The weight of her father's legacy pressed down, heavier than the antique paperweight she idly rotated. The lawyer's call echoed in her ears, the investor's demands, the threat of ruin. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the numbness. She closed her eyes, the scent of old books and leather filling the void. Isabella's face swam into her mind's eye, her smile, warm and comforting, a stark contrast to the icy hostility she'd encountered at the board meeting. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, hot against the cool skin. The phone rang again, the shrill tone jarring. It was Isabella. "Clara, darling, how are you?" Isabella's voice was a balm, soothing the raw edges of her anxiety. I'm trying," Clara whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "They want a scapegoat, Isabella. They're blaming me. Don't let them." Isabella's voice was firm, laced with unwavering support. "You are not responsible for your father's actions. You are strong, Clara. Remember that." Clara took a deep breath, the scent of jasmine, Isabella's signature perfume, a phantom touch against her senses. The memory of Isabella's embrace, a haven of warmth and acceptance, momentarily calmed the storm within. "I'm trying to be strong," she replied, her voice regaining some of its strength. "But it's overwhelming. The business, the scandal, the lies. We will face it together," Isabella promised, her voice resonating with quiet strength. "We'll find a way. We always do." A pause. "Come home, my love. Come home to me." Clara looked out at the sprawling cityscape, the glittering lights a cruel mockery of the turmoil in her heart. Home, a word that once denoted a gilded cage, now represented a sanctuary, a refuge in the storm. She closed her eyes, a new resolve forming. The fight for her future, for her family, for the truth had become a fight for her home. And she wouldn't surrender. The boardroom felt like a mausoleum. The polished mahogany gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting the grim faces surrounding Clara. The air, thick with the scent of expensive cologne and simmering resentment, pressed down on her like a physical weight. Each whispered comment, each pointed glance, felt like a tiny, sharp jab. She clutched her father's antique pen, its cool metal a strange comfort in the suffocating atmosphere. "We need to protect the company's reputation," Ms. Moreau, the lead investor, Mr. Harding, stated, his voice laced with thinly veiled accusation. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept over her, assessing, judging. Clara met his gaze, her own eyes burning with a mixture of anger and weariness. "And how do you propose we do that, Mr. Harding? By sacrificing me?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the low hum of the air conditioning. The weight of her father's legacy, the crushing responsibility, pressed down on her. She felt the familiar sting of tears behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give them the satisfaction. "We need a scapegoat," Harding continued, his voice devoid of empathy. "Someone to absorb the blame, to protect the company's future." Clara stood up, the chair scraping against the polished floor, the sound amplified in the tense silence. The pen in her hand felt suddenly heavy, a symbol of the burden she carried. "I will not allow you to destroy my family to save your investments," she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "My father's mistakes were his own, and I will not be made to pay for them." She slammed the pen down on the table, the sharp metallic click echoing in the stunned silence. She turned and walked out, the scent of old leather and mahogany clinging to her clothes, a stark contrast to the coldness she left behind. The weight of the scandal remained, a heavy cloak that trailed her out into the crisp night air. The biting November wind whipped Clara's hair across her face as she hurried down the steps of the courthouse. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind her with a resounding thud, echoing the turmoil inside. The crisp air stung her cheeks, a welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the courtroom. She hadn't anticipated the sheer brutality of the legal battle, the relentless attacks on her father's reputation, now inextricably linked to her own. It felt as though they were trying to erase him, to erase her very existence. She pulled her coat tighter, the wool scratching against her skin, a minor discomfort compared to the gnawing anxiety in her stomach. Her phone vibrated, a text from Isabella. * safe home. Don't worry. * Clara felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of gratitude for her mother's unwavering support. It was Isabella's quiet strength that anchored her in the storm. The city lights blurred through her tears. She hadn't eaten all day, the emptiness in her stomach mirroring the hollow ache in her heart. The legal team had warned her about this, the relentless pressure to settle, to sacrifice a portion of her father's empire to avoid a protracted public scandal. But Clara refused. She wouldn't let them rewrite history, diminish her father's life, or erase her own identity. Reaching her apartment, she collapsed onto the worn velvet sofa, the plush fabric a small comfort against the hardness of the day. A half-empty glass of wine sat on the coffee table, a testament to her solitary evening. She picked it up, swirling the amber liquid, its bitter taste a fitting metaphor for her current situation. The phone rang, startling her. It was Richard's lawyer. "Clara." His voice was grave, weary. "They've upped their offer. Significantly. Enough to secure the company's future. But..." He paused. The silence stretched taut between them. "It means relinquishing control. Giving up a significant portion of the inheritance." Clara closed her eyes, the scent of old books and leather from her father's study flooding her memory. A poignant reminder of the life she was now fighting to protect. Not for the wealth, not for the power, but for the legacy, for the man she was finally learning to understand and forgive. "Tell them I'll consider it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But even as the words escaped her lips, she knew her answer. She wouldn't sacrifice her truth or her family, no matter the cost. The fight was far from over. The lawyer's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Clara stared out at the rain lashing against the window panes, each drop a tiny mirror reflecting her own internal turmoil. The city lights, usually a dazzling spectacle, were muted, blurred by tears she couldn't quite hold back. The offer was substantial, enough to secure the future of Richard's empire, a legacy she'd once taken for granted. Now it felt like a poisoned chalice. "But," she prompted, her voice a fragile thread. "But it comes with a price, Clara. A very public price." His tone was sympathetic yet firm. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, filled only with the rhythmic drumming of the rain. She imagined her father, his face etched with worry, his eyes reflecting the same storm raging within her. The image of Isabella, her face lined with exhaustion but radiating quiet strength, flashed before her. The shared meals, the whispered conversations, the nascent bond they were forging, all threatened by this looming decision. Giving up control meant betraying not just her father's memory but also herself, her newfound family. "I need time," she finally managed, her voice shaking. "I need to think." "I understand," the lawyer said softly. "But the opposing counsel is pressing. They want an answer by the end of the week." The phone clicked dead, leaving Clara alone with the weight of her decision. She rose, the plush velvet of the sofa a cold comfort against the chill that seeped into her bones. She walked to the window, the rain a relentless, unforgiving backdrop to her internal struggle. Giving in felt like surrendering a part of herself, a betrayal of the truth she'd fought so hard to uncover. But the alternative, a protracted legal battle that would drag her father's name through the mud, was equally devastating. The cost of fighting, she realized, was not merely financial, but emotional, potentially shattering the fragile peace she'd finally found. The rain continued to fall, mirroring the tears finally spilling down her cheeks, a silent testament to the impossible choices she faced. The mahogany boardroom felt colder than the rain outside. Clara traced the grain of the table, the polished surface a stark contrast to the rough edges of her predicament. The lawyer's words echoed in the silence, a public price. The scent of old leather and expensive coffee did little to soothe her frayed nerves. She pictured Isabella's face, etched with worry mirroring her own. The thought of shattering the tentative peace they'd built, of exposing their family secrets to the vultures of the media, was unbearable. A wave of nausea washed over her. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. The weight of Richard's legacy, once a source of pride, now felt like an anchor dragging her down. "But what if I lose?" she whispered, more to herself than to the empty room. The thought of losing not just the business, but the integrity of her father's memory, was a chilling prospect. The lawyer's earlier words returned. "They want an answer by the end of the week." The ticking clock in the corner seemed to amplify the pressure, each second a hammer blow against her resolve. Her reflection in the polished wood showed a woman on the brink, her eyes filled with a weariness far beyond her years. She closed her eyes, picturing her father's kind smile, the warmth of Isabella's embrace. The choice felt impossible, a cruel paradox. Protect her family's secrets or fight for the truth, risking everything in the process. She could hear the whisper of the rain outside, a constant reminder of the storm raging inside. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek, a small testament to the overwhelming burden she carried. The fight, she realized, was not just about a business empire, but about her identity, her family, and her future. The week ahead loomed, a battlefield where she would fight for the heart of her life. The weight of the week pressed down on Clara like a physical burden. The rain, a relentless drumming against the tall windows of her apartment, mirrored the storm within. Isabella's worried face swam before her eyes, a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal luxury surrounding her. She picked up a framed photograph, Richard in his younger years, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, a carefree spirit that seemed a lifetime away. The opulent apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage. "He wouldn't want this," Isabella's voice, soft but firm, cut through Clara's thoughts. She entered, a steaming mug in her hands, the aroma of chamomile a fragile counterpoint to the tension filling the air. Clara looked up, her eyes brimming. "He wouldn't want me to lose everything," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But what choice do I have?" Isabella sat beside her, her hand covering Clara's. The warmth was a small comfort in the chilling reality of their situation. "We fight," Isabella said, her voice steady. "Together, we fight for the truth, for your father's memory, and for ourselves." Clara leaned into Isabella's touch, the strength in her mother's grip a lifeline in the turbulent sea of her emotions. "But the cost," Clara trailed off, the fear a tangible thing in the hushed apartment. The threat of losing everything, the empire, her reputation, the fragile peace they'd built, loomed large. Isabella squeezed her hand. "There's more to life than money, Clara. More than this facade. We have each other. We have the truth. That's worth more than any inheritance." Her words were simple, yet carried the weight of a lifetime of sacrifices. Clara closed her eyes, picturing her father's face. She saw not just the wealthy magnate, but the man who loved Isabella, the man who regretted his mistakes. The image, sharp and poignant, gave her strength. It wasn't about the empire. It was about honoring her father's memory, her own identity, and the love she'd found in the most unexpected of places. She opened her eyes, a new resolve hardening her gaze. "You're right," she said, her voice stronger now, steadier. "We fight." The rain outside continued its relentless assault, but inside, a quiet defiance burned. The next morning brought a chilling clarity. The sunlight, usually a welcome guest in Clara's opulent apartment, felt harsh, exposing the dust motes dancing in the otherwise flawless space. The silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of an antique clock, amplified her internal turmoil. She sat at her father's mahogany desk, the same desk where she discovered the photograph that shattered her world. The scent of old paper and leather, once comforting, now felt suffocating. Isabella entered quietly, her presence a balm in the tense atmosphere. She carried a file, its worn leather suggesting a long-held secret. "I found this," she said softly, her voice a low murmur against the echoing silence. "It's from Richard's lawyer. Details about the trust, and a clause about contesting it." Clara's breath hitched. Contesting it? But what about the empire? The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, tightening with each passing second. The thought of losing everything, of facing the scorn of society, was almost unbearable. Isabella sat beside her, her hand resting gently on Clara's. "It's not just about the money, darling. It's about the truth about your father's wishes, and the life he wanted for you, the life he couldn't give you then." The lawyer's file detailed a complex web of financial maneuvering, designed to protect Clara's inheritance should Richard's business ventures fail. But there was also mention of a secondary trust, a smaller fund, explicitly earmarked for Isabella. A silent testament to Richard's enduring love and a lifetime of regret. Clara ran a trembling hand over the aged paper, the words blurring through her tears. He cared," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. The weight of years of emotional distance crumbled under the realization of her father's profound, unspoken love. "He did, my dear," Isabella affirmed, her voice thick with emotion. "He loved you both immensely, more than you could ever know." The rain started again, a persistent drumming against the windows. But this time, the sound didn't feel like a mirror of her despair. It felt like the steady rhythm of life, washing away the dust of deceit and revealing a clearer path. A path leading to a future where truth, not wealth, would define her legacy. Clara looked at her mother, at the woman who had sacrificed everything for love, and a faint smile touched her lips. The fight wouldn't be easy, but it would be a fight worth fighting. For herself, for her father's memory, and for the love that had finally found its way home. The lawyer's letter felt brittle in Clara's trembling hand, the ink a faded ghost of a life lived in shadows. Rain lashed against the windows of the opulent apartment, mirroring the storm raging within her. The scent of lilies, usually a comforting presence, now felt cloyingly sweet, a stark contrast to the bitter taste of betrayal lingering on her tongue. Isabella, her mother, sat beside her, her hand a warm anchor in the chaos. "A secondary trust," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. "For you." Isabella nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He always intended for me to have something, a small provision, a symbol of his remorse. It wasn't about replacing your inheritance, darling. It was about acknowledging his debt." The weight of Richard's actions pressed down on Clara, a crushing burden of guilt and regret interwoven with the burgeoning joy of finally knowing her mother. She pictured her father, the stern, remote man she'd known, wrestling with his conscience, his love for both women a silent, agonizing battle fought in the quiet corners of his heart. "But the business, the empire," Clara murmured, the fear threatening to overwhelm her newfound hope. The thought of a scandal, of the judgmental whispers, chilled her to the bone. Isabella squeezed her hand, her touch firm and reassuring. "Your father built that empire, but it doesn't define you, Clara. Your worth isn't measured in dollars and cents. We'll face this together, whatever it may bring." A tentative smile touched Clara's lips. Isabella's words, simple yet profound, chipped away at the wall of fear she'd erected. The fear wasn't gone, but it no longer held the same suffocating power. She had her mother, a fierce, unwavering ally. She had the truth, and that, she realized, was worth more than any fortune. The rain softened, its rhythm calming, almost soothing. The storm within Clara raged on, but now it was a storm of emotions: grief, fear, but also a growing sense of purpose, of self-discovery. The fight for her inheritance, for her father's legacy, would be a fight for her own identity, a fight to claim her rightful place in a world that had once felt so alien. The future was still uncertain, a vast, uncharted territory. But for the first time in a long time, Clara felt ready to navigate it. Not alone, but hand in hand with the woman who had loved her from afar. A silent, enduring love that had finally found its voice. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of her father's power, now felt oppressive, a monument to secrets and lies. Clara traced the grain of the wood, her fingers lingering on the faint, almost imperceptible scratches, a silent testament to years of unspoken anxieties. The rain outside mirrored the tempest in her soul. Isabella, her mother, sat across from her, a comforting presence amidst the swirling chaos. "I don't understand," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. "Why the secrecy? Why couldn't he just tell me?" Isabella's gaze was filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "The times were different, Clara. Society wouldn't have understood. He was protecting you in his own flawed way. He loved you both desperately." She reached across the desk, her hand covering Clara's. The warmth was a palpable comfort. "But the deception," Clara choked out, tears welling in her eyes. "The years of lies, the distance, it was all a lie. He carried that burden, my darling," Isabella said softly, her voice laced with grief. "He thought he was doing what was best. He believed he was protecting you from the scandal, from the judgment of others. He was wrong, terribly wrong, but his love for you was never in doubt." The scent of old books and leather filled the air, a familiar comfort now tinged with bittersweet memories. Clara imagined her father, a young man burning with a forbidden passion, his heart torn between two women he loved with equal intensity. The weight of his choices, of his mistakes, settled heavily on her shoulders. "What now?" Clara asked, her voice barely a breath. "What do I do with all this?" Isabella squeezed her hand. "You decide, my love. You decide who you are, what you want. Your life is yours to shape. Don't let the past dictate your future. You are stronger than you think." Clara looked out at the rain-swept city, a million lights twinkling below. A newfound strength bloomed within her, a defiant flower pushing through the cracks in the concrete. The fight for her inheritance wasn't just about money. It was about claiming her own identity, her own narrative. She would face the world, not as the sheltered daughter of a millionaire, but as Clara, a woman finally finding her place in a family that was both familiar and completely new. The storm outside was beginning to subside. Within her, a fragile calm was taking hold. The days that followed were a blur of hushed conversations, legal consultations, and the unsettling quiet of Richard's mansion, now heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. The scent of antiseptic, a stark contrast to the familiar aroma of old books and leather, permeated the air as Richard lay in his bed, his once robust frame thinned and weakened by an aggressive illness. His breathing, shallow and ragged, filled the room with a mournful rhythm. Clara sat by his side, holding his frail hand. His skin, once tanned and firm, was now paper-thin, translucent almost, revealing the delicate network of veins beneath. The weight of her anger, her grief, her confusion, felt less acute now, replaced by a quiet sorrow. She saw not the powerful, distant father she'd known, but a broken man, consumed by regret. "Clara," he rasped, his voice a mere whisper. I'm sorry." The apology, simple yet profound, broke through the dam of her suppressed emotions. Tears streamed down her face, hot and relentless, mingling with the chill of the room. I forgive you, Papa," she whispered back, her voice trembling. The words felt inadequate, insufficient to encompass the years of distance, the pain of betrayal, the years of unspoken love. But they were true. She saw the depths of his remorse, the genuine agony etched on his face. Isabella entered quietly, her presence a soft counterpoint to the heavy atmosphere. She brought a cup of warm tea, her touch gentle as she placed it on the bedside table. The quiet strength she exuded was a comfort to Clara, a silent reassurance in the face of impending loss. Richard looked at them both, his eyes flickering with a flicker of his old vitality, a glimmer of understanding. "You two together?" he murmured, a faint smile playing on his lips. That's all I ever wanted." His words, laced with exhaustion yet filled with a profound sense of peace, settled upon them like a gentle benediction. The storm within Clara had subsided, leaving behind a profound sense of stillness. She knew the future held uncertainties, challenges, and adjustments, but the foundations were laid, a foundation of family, forgiveness, and the enduring power of love, finally unshackled from the chains of secrecy and societal expectations. The rain outside had stopped, and a soft sunlight filtered through the window, illuminating the fragile scene with a ray of hope. The scent of lilies, sharp and sweet, battled with the lingering antiseptic. Richard's breathing, though still shallow, had steadied slightly. Clara, exhausted but strangely calm, leaned against the plush headboard, her hand still clasped in his. Isabella sat nearby, a silent sentinel, her presence a soothing balm. The muted light filtering through the drawn curtains cast long shadows across the room, creating an ethereal, almost sacred atmosphere. "Clara," Richard whispered, his voice stronger than before, "there's something I need to tell you." His eyes, usually bright and sharp, were clouded with fatigue, yet a spark of determination flickered within them. Clara squeezed his hand. "Papa, I know." The words were a relief, both spoken and unspoken. "No," he insisted, his voice barely a breath. "About the business." His gaze shifted, landing on Isabella, then back to Clara. "There are complications. Things I kept hidden, even from you." He spoke then of hidden accounts, offshore investments, a web of deceit spun to protect his family, and inadvertently to keep Isabella hidden. The weight of his confession pressed down on the room, thick and heavy. Clara listened, her initial shock replaced by a weary understanding. It wasn't just about Isabella. It was about a life lived in shadows, a legacy built on secrets. I never wanted to hurt you," Richard rasped, his voice cracking. He looked at Clara, searching her eyes for forgiveness he so desperately craved. Isabella reached out, placing her hand over Clara's. "He tried to do what he thought was best, Clara," she said softly. The pressure of her hand was gentle, understanding. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal maneuvering and tearful reconciliations. Clara, with Isabella's unwavering support, began to navigate the treacherous waters of her father's empire, uncovering layers of deception and questionable dealings. She faced scorn, suspicion, even threats, but found unexpected allies in some of her father's longtime associates. They saw in her not just Richard's daughter, but a woman of strength and integrity, someone worthy of carrying on his legacy, albeit in a far more transparent manner. The rain outside had finally stopped. A soft sunlight streamed through the window, warming the room and illuminating the quiet strength that had settled between Clara and Isabella. A bond forged in adversity, and sealed with shared grief and a promise of a new beginning. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of Richard's power, now felt heavy with the weight of his secrets. Clara, sifting through the meticulously organized files, found a small, leather-bound diary. Its worn edges whispered of years past, of untold stories. The faint scent of old paper and leather filled the air, a tangible link to a past she was only beginning to understand. She opened it, the brittle pages rustling like dry leaves. Isabella sat beside her, her hand resting lightly on Clara's arm. The silence between them was thick with unspoken emotions, a shared burden, a nascent bond. Clara read aloud, her voice trembling slightly. "Isabella, my dearest Isabella, I cannot live without you." The words were Richard's, penned in a familiar yet strangely distant hand. The raw emotion on the page mirrored the turmoil in Clara's heart. She felt a pang of sorrow for the young man who wrote those words, a man she barely knew. He loved her so much, Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. The unspoken question hung in the air. How could a love so profound be so utterly erased? Clara looked up, her gaze meeting Isabella's. "And he loved me too," she said, the statement more a question than a declaration. The truth was, she was still struggling to reconcile the conflicting emotions, the betrayal, the loss, and the nascent love for the woman who was both stranger and mother. The diary offered fragments, glimpses into a passionate, forbidden romance, stifled by societal pressures and Richard's own fear. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light. The scene was quiet, yet charged with an unspoken understanding. The weight of Richard's legacy pressed heavily on Clara, yet in Isabella's presence, a strange sense of peace settled within her. It was a peace born not of forgetting, but of acceptance, a shared acknowledgement of the past and a tentative step towards a future still shrouded in uncertainty, yet filled with the promise of a new kind of family. This newly forming bond offered a fragile hope, a light against the darkness of the past. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Clara felt less alone. Richard's failing health cast a long shadow over the opulent mansion. The once vibrant patriarch, his booming laughter now replaced by a frail cough, was confined to his bed. Clara, haunted by the diary's revelations, spent her days flitting between his bedside and Isabella's quiet presence in the guest wing. The scent of lilies, Isabella's favorite, mingled with the antiseptic smell of the hospital equipment. "He's fading, Clara," Isabella whispered one evening, her voice thick with unshed tears. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows that danced on the portraits lining the walls, portraits of a life Clara was only beginning to understand. Clara nodded, her own eyes brimming. The weight of her father's secrets, once a crushing burden, now felt different. Less a betrayal, more a tragic misunderstanding, a consequence of a time when love dared not speak its name. "He needs you," Isabella continued, her hand finding Clara's. "He needs to know he's forgiven." The following days were a blur of hushed conversations, tearful reconciliations, and the quiet acceptance of mortality. Richard, weakened but lucid, held Clara's hand, his gaze filled with a mixture of regret and profound love. He confessed his deepest fears, his agonizing choice, the weight of his silence. His voice, a mere rasp, spoke of a love lost and a daughter found. I never meant to hurt you, cara mia," he whispered, his breath shallow. Clara leaned in, her own tears falling freely. "I know, Papa," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. The anger, the betrayal, the years of emotional distance. It all seemed to melt away in the face of his vulnerability. Isabella watched them, a bittersweet smile gracing her lips. The years of separation, the pain, the sacrifices, they were all slowly dissolving, replaced by a fragile, hard-won peace. The three of them, bound by a shared history of loss and a dawning hope for the future, found solace in each other's presence. The mahogany desk, once a symbol of Richard's power and secrecy, now seemed less ominous, more a repository of memories both painful and precious. The scent of lilies and old paper, once linked to secrets, now carried the scent of healing and reconciliation. The sun streamed through the window, casting a warm light on the scene, a promise of a new dawn. The chill morning air held the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Richard was gone. The silence in the mansion was profound, a stark contrast to the cacophony of his booming voice that had once filled every room. Clara stood by the window, the sunrise painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, a beauty that felt jarringly at odds with the emptiness in her heart. Tears traced paths through the dust on her cheeks. She hadn't cried like this since she was a child, a small, lost thing clutching a tattered teddy bear. Isabella entered quietly, her footsteps barely audible on the thick carpet. She carried a steaming mug, the aroma of chamomile tea filling the air. "He's at peace now," she said softly, placing the mug in Clara's trembling hand. The warmth seeped into her chilled fingers, a small comfort in the vast ocean of her grief. Clara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The weight of his absence pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. Yet, interwoven with the grief was a strange sense of release. The years of unspoken words, of carefully constructed walls, were finally gone, replaced by a quiet understanding. "He loved you, Clara," Isabella said, her voice low and steady. "More than words can ever say." Clara looked at the sunrise, its brilliance no longer a painful contrast, but a reflection of the new light breaking through the darkness in her own heart. "I know," she whispered, a single tear escaping and tracing a slow path down her cheek. The grief remained, a shadow clinging to her, but it no longer defined her. She had found her mother, her history, her true self, and in that discovery, she had found a strength she never knew she possessed. The future stretched before her, vast and uncertain, but no longer terrifying. It was a future she would face, not alone, but with Isabella at her side. The scent of chamomile, a delicate counterpoint to the lingering scent of lilies, symbolized a new beginning, a gentle healing. The funeral was a blur of somber faces and hushed whispers. The scent of lilies, Richard's favorite, hung heavy in the air, a cloying sweetness that mirrored the bittersweet ache in Clara's chest. She stood beside Isabella, the cool silk of her mother's hand a comforting weight against hers. The earth, freshly turned and dark, seemed to absorb the grief radiating from the assembled mourners. A single robin chirped, a fragile sound lost in the vastness of her sorrow. Later, back at the mansion, the silence was deafening. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams slanting through the tall windows. Clara wandered through the familiar rooms, each object a ghost of memories both happy and heartbreaking. She paused before her father's study, the door slightly ajar. She hesitated, then pushed it open. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and pipe tobacco, a phantom reminder of his presence. On the desk, amidst a scattering of papers, lay a single unopened letter, its creamy envelope bearing a familiar, elegant script. Isabella entered, her eyes mirroring Clara's apprehension. "That's from your Aunt Margaret," she said softly, indicating the letter. "She wrote just after the funeral." Clara picked up the letter, its weight surprisingly heavy in her hand. The familiar script brought a fresh wave of sadness, a pang of guilt for not having been closer to her aunt before now. She had always been so busy with her privileged life, so disconnected from this part of her family's history. "I should read it," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. I should know what she has to say." Isabella nodded, her gaze filled with understanding. "Take your time, darling," she said gently. "There's no rush." Clara sank into the leather armchair behind the desk, the worn upholstery sinking beneath her. She opened the letter, the crisp crackle a fragile counterpoint to the weight in her heart. As she began to read, the words blurring through her tears, a quiet understanding began to bloom in the space of her grief. She was not alone. She had her mother, her newfound family, and the legacy of both her fathers, flawed yet undeniably loving, to guide her. The future remained unwritten, but now it was a story she would help write, alongside the woman who had given her life. The weight of Richard's absence pressed down on Clara, a tangible thing in the silent mansion. The scent of lilies, though fading, still clung to the air, a ghostly perfume of grief. She sat at the grand piano, her fingers tracing the ivory keys, the cold smoothness a stark contrast to the burning ache in her chest. The melody she half-played was hesitant, broken, mirroring her own fragmented state. Isabella entered quietly, carrying a tray with steaming mugs. "Tea," she offered, her voice soft, a balm against the silence. Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She took the mug, the warmth spreading through her hands, a small comfort in the vast emptiness. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered, the words still feeling strange, yet oddly right. Isabella sat beside her, her hand resting lightly on Clara's. "He would have wanted you to be strong," she said, her gaze steady and unwavering. "He loved you so much." A tear escaped Clara's eye, tracing a path down her cheek. I wish I'd known him better," she choked out, the words laced with regret. I wish I had shown him." "You showed him," Isabella interrupted gently, squeezing her hand. "Your presence in his life, even if he didn't fully understand it until the end, was enough. He knew. He felt it." The words were a lifeline, pulling Clara from the depths of her sorrow. A long silence followed, punctuated only by the gentle clinking of their mugs. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light. It felt like a lifetime since she had discovered the photograph, since the impossible truth had shattered her world. "He left me something," Clara finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "A letter. Aunt Margaret's." She picked up the letter from the piano, its creamy envelope still crisp. "I haven't opened it yet." Isabella's expression was thoughtful. "Perhaps it's best to wait," she suggested. "Give yourself time. Let the grief settle." Clara looked down at the letter, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. It wasn't just grief, she realized. There was a deeper unease, a sense of anticipation, almost of dread. This letter, from a relative she barely knew, held a piece of the puzzle she hadn't yet found. This was more than just her father's legacy. It was a missing piece of her own identity. The future was uncertain, but with her mother beside her, Clara felt a newfound strength, a quiet resolve to face whatever the letter might hold, whatever secrets it might reveal. The funeral was a blur of somber faces and hushed whispers. The scent of lilies, Richard's favorite, hung heavy in the air, a cloying sweetness that did little to mask the underlying bitterness of loss. Clara felt numb, a hollow shell moving through the motions of grief. The weight of the mahogany coffin felt symbolic, the finality of a chapter, the closing of a door. Later, alone in her father's study, the silence was deafening. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams slicing through the tall windows, illuminating the intricate carvings on the antique desk. She picked up the letter. Aunt Margaret's elegant script a stark contrast to the chaotic emotions churning within her. Hesitantly, she tore open the envelope. The crisp paper held a story of hidden affairs, silenced whispers, and a desperate attempt to protect a child born from a forbidden love. It detailed the pressure Richard faced, the social stigma that threatened to ruin his reputation, and his agonizing decision to conceal Isabella's existence. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, a mix of sadness and a dawning understanding. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a desperate act of love, twisted and flawed, but love nonetheless. She finally understood her father's silent grief, the unspoken distance that had always hung between them. Isabella entered softly, her presence a comforting warmth in the cold room. "It's all right to cry, darling," she murmured, her voice gentle as she settled beside Clara. The touch of her hand on Clara's shoulder was a silent reassurance, a connection forged in sorrow and shared understanding. "He loved you both, more than words can ever say." Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the letter. The past was still a painful puzzle, but the pieces were slowly falling into place, revealing a more nuanced and complicated picture. The weight of the past was heavy, but it didn't crush her. It shaped her, strengthened her, allowing her to finally embrace the future. A future that now included both a mother and a legacy she was determined to honor. The weight of Richard's absence settled heavily on Clara. His study, once a symbol of intimidating formality, now felt strangely empty, echoing with the ghosts of unspoken words. The scent of old leather and pipe tobacco, once so familiar, now hung heavy with the poignant reminder of his loss. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays, a silent ballet of time moving relentlessly forward. She spent hours sifting through his belongings, not searching for anything specific, but for a connection, a tangible link to the man she'd finally begun to understand. She found a worn leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. Hesitantly, she opened it. His elegant script detailed not just business dealings, but also his inner turmoil, his desperate love for Isabella, the agonizing choices he'd made. Tears blurred the ink as she read of his sleepless nights, his constant fear of discovery. Isabella found her there, curled in a worn armchair, the journal open in her lap. The quiet rustle of the pages was the only sound in the room, a fragile counterpoint to the storm raging within Clara. "He loved you, you know?" Isabella whispered, her voice husky with emotion. She sat beside Clara, her hand gently covering Clara's. The touch was familiar, comforting, a silent affirmation of a bond forged in the crucible of shared grief and newly discovered kinship. Clara looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, swollen with tears. I'm still trying to understand," she choked out, her voice thick with emotion. "The lies, the secrecy. It feels like I've lived a lie myself." Isabella nodded, her own eyes glistening. "Your father's actions were wrong. There's no denying that. But the love he felt for both of us was real. He was trapped by circumstances, by the expectations of his time. He loved you fiercely, Clara. He just didn't know how to show it." Clara leaned against Isabella, the warmth of her mother's embrace a balm to her wounded soul. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the unspoken understanding that transcended words. It was the quiet acceptance of a complex, painful past, a shared acknowledgement of love's many flawed expressions, and the slow, tentative beginnings of healing. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time, Clara felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile but persistent belief that she could navigate this new reality, finding her place, her identity, within the embrace of a family she had only just found. The scent of lilies, Richard's favorite, hung heavy in the air, a poignant counterpoint to the sterile hospital smell. Clara knelt beside his coffin, the polished mahogany a cold, unyielding surface beneath her trembling fingers. She traced the engraved inscription, "Richard Harding, a loving father." The words felt like a cruel joke, a stark contrast to the years of emotional distance. Yet, in the past few months, a fragile bridge had been built, a connection forged in the fire of shared secrets and mutual forgiveness. Isabella's hand rested gently on Clara's shoulder, a silent offering of comfort. The cool touch was a stark contrast to the warmth that had grown between them, a bond born not of blood alone but of shared experience and an enduring love. Clara looked up at her mother, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. The grief was sharp, a raw, physical ache in her chest, but it wasn't the all-consuming devastation she'd anticipated. "He's at peace now," Isabella whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The words were a balm, a gentle reassurance that soothed the turmoil within Clara. The sunlight streamed through the chapel window, casting long shadows across the polished floor. I still miss him," Clara confessed, her voice choked with emotion. "But it's different now. Knowing the truth, knowing the man he truly was, not just the one he presented to the world." Isabella squeezed her shoulder, her eyes filled with a profound understanding. "The truth hurts," she said softly, "but it also sets you free." Clara nodded, slowly, her gaze drifting to the lilies. She thought of the forbidden love, the sacrifices, the decades of secrets. Her father's life, once a tapestry of carefully constructed lies, was now woven with threads of truth, revealing a flawed, yet ultimately human story of love, loss, and regret. And in the heart of that tangled narrative, she had found her own truth, her own identity, and the enduring love of a mother she'd never known. The grief remained, but it was tempered by the warmth of acceptance, the quiet solace of forgiveness. The future stretched ahead, uncertain yet hopeful, a blank canvas upon which she could paint her own life, finally free from the shadows of the past. The funeral was over. The muted gray of the November sky mirrored the somber mood clinging to Clara. Back at the sprawling Harding estate, the silence felt heavier than the grief. Each room whispered memories, Richard's booming laughter in the study, the faint scent of his pipe tobacco lingering in the air, the sterile, antiseptic smell of his final days. Isabella, ever watchful, poured Clara a cup of chamomile tea. The steam curled upwards, mirroring the swirling thoughts in Clara's mind. "He loved those lilies?" Isabella said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the crackling fire. The aroma, sharp and sweet, stung Clara's nose, a bittersweet reminder. I know," Clara replied, her voice catching.